Emperor is not only loathed to his treacheries against the gods, but the anathema to all human life.
In the darkest period for mankind, one man would come to the fore. He would unite the tattered remnants of humanity and would rise to become the leader of all. His wisdom and strength unrivaled, his mere presence inspired loyalty. Any other names are all now lost to the mists of time. He is now known only as the Emperor of Man. Thousands of human worlds have been ruined by the warp storms amid the aftermath of the Great War versus the Men of Iron. Human survivors remaining on these planets of anarchy lived in fear of scavengers, raiders, blood-crazed cannibals, and on many worlds the fear of nightmarish demonic incursion. They feared, as their primitive ancestors once had, more than anything, the night, the darkness. The darkness promised only horror, bloodshed, screaming, death, and extremes of violence. Across many planets though, including Terra, not all lived in squalor. Some had forged noble houses or settlements who were able to support large defensive forces. Hulking warriors forged in global wars as mankind fought as it had done many thousands of years before for territory, resources, and the safety of its own people. On Terra itself, many had begun to see a new army marching, an army of thundering giants. Clad in magnificent and powerful armor, they had crushed and swept away any who stood against them, for none could resist their power. War ravaged the planet, and most importantly, old tyrants, dictators and despots were exterminated, and those citizens who remained would pledge to the singular service of this military campaign's architect. The Emperor would stand triumphant on his home, the world of mankind's origin. The death and conflict here would slowly come to a close, for there was no one left to conquer, and more importantly, no one left to question the validity of this imposing golden figure of a man. Uria Olather was a simple man, now an old man, a priest by virtue of personal experience, not holy indoctrination. A man who had long ago seen this army of giants marching against those who had once favoured the night, for it shadowed their evil deeds. But now they feared it as much as those they had hunted. The end of these dark times should have been something for celebration, to rejoice and be thankful for, not for Uria. His services had once been popular, but no longer. Along with the victory of this powerful army came a wave of disbelief and ridicule for those who believed, those who had faith. Where people once had fear and sought divine protection, now they feared no more. His congregation had dwindled and then all but ceased, yet he remained. Uria waited for his midnight service, once popular, now rarely attended. Small flames licking the walls as the rain steadily drummed against the roof and the wind lashed against the walls of the church. He heard voices outside. Worshippers finally. No, guests, but unwelcome ones. As the door swung open, he would see darkened figures lit only by the occasional flashes of lightning outside. He didn't feel fear, but he did feel a troubling sense of unease. These were not men of faith, they were men of violence. As Uriah tried his best to welcome them, the hooded figure who stepped forth into the church sternly declined and closed the door to his companions outside. Uriah introduced himself as Uriah Olather, the last priest of the Church of the Lightning Stone. The strange man explained that his name was unimportant, but that he could be referred to as Revelation. They would briefly discuss the artistry of the church and sit to share wine. The strange figure wore clothes much like any other, but his were immaculate. He wore a robe of crimson red and a silver ring with a strange marking upon it, a device even. Revelation had already explained to Uriah that the reason he visited tonight was so as to be able to view this church of his, the last church on Terra, and that history would soon consign these places of worship as relics of the past. He questioned Uriah as to why he still chose to remain. Why did he not want to join with so many others who had heard of this emperor and his crusade to extinguish all forms of religion, spirituality and mysticism, to erase the misplaced beliefs in the supernatural? Uriah was defiant. His beliefs were his own, and his faith was unmovable. He cared not, even if the forces of the Emperor came here to tear down and destroy his church. No warmongering despot could shift his strength of belief. Revelation called him obstinate. Uriah called it faith. Mocking him, Revelation stated, "A willing belief in the unbelievable without proof?" Uriah fired back, "What makes faith so powerful is that it requires no proof. Belief is enough." "I see now why the Emperor wants rid of it," said Revelation. "You call faith powerful. I call it dangerous. Think of what people in the grip of faith have done in the past, all the atrocities committed down the centuries by people of faith. Politics has slain its thousands, but religion has slain its millions." If it were not abundantly clear by this point, the darkened figure who had entered the Church of the Lightning Stone was indeed the Emperor himself, setting foot in the last church on Earth to challenge the last priest and test his beliefs. The absurdity of his arguments clear for any to see, given what was to come in the following millennia. From the Emperor would come the Crusades that would crush any who opposed them. In fact, any who were found to have religious beliefs that could not be convinced otherwise or serve some useful purpose were simply slaughtered. And this was before the time of the heresy, where millions would die in the wars of those without faith and those who were consumed by it. Revelation would apologize for his overtly confrontational tone. Uriah accepted, and instead would see more of his church. Revelation would listen to Uriah tell its history. Revelation, the Emperor, would continue to challenge Uriah when he revealed the church's most holy artifact, the Lightning Stone itself. "Why is it holy?" he would ask. "Was it deposited by your God? A man martyred here? A young girl received some revelation?" Uriah would describe how an old man, thousands of years before, deaf and blind, had taken shelter from a storm below the stone, only for it to be struck by lightning, and curing his ailments, it was said to have had healing properties. The townspeople would build a church around this holy stone. The Emperor, examining the stone, stated, without showing any special interest or emotion, "Hematite from a banded ironstone formation, exposed by a landslip most likely. That would explain the lightning strike. I'm not being malicious, I'm explaining to you how such a thing could have happened, without any intervention of godly power." The conversations here between the Emperor and Uriah bear a strong similarity to conversations his Primarch sons would have later in time, where they would repeat his cold and indoctrinated beliefs that all could be explained with science. Magnus the Red, prior to the turning of so many of the legions to chaos, spoke of the warp and its entities. "Because they're nonsense, brother. Gods and demons and sprites and witches, you should listen to yourselves. We call it the ocean. It is a product of galactic harmonics, something to be explored. Some of its manifestations seem to be of a sentient kind, at least in outline, but that is not how things are, the way our minds make it appear, what they conjure to help us understand it. We must do our best to make sense of the vortices, and so what do we cling to? The old figures and archetypes once we used when we were scrabbling around in the dirt." Magnus apparently perceived the warp and its entities early on as nothing to be taken any more seriously than the material realm, easily explained rationally because his views were dictated by the Emperor, views that placed many of the Emperor's finest in highly dangerous positions of corrupting manipulation. Yet we see these strongly held principles of the Emperor being pushed onto Uriah. The Emperor, at least through his words, appears to fully reject the idea of spiritual beings by explaining away the lightning stone as mere natural events. He goes on to explain to Uriah that this is normal for humans, that a man, especially an already religious man, might perceive that such elemental energy, even if it did have healing properties, would often be seen by your mortal human as something of a divine nature. But that this was something humans do all the time, that they project spirits or fears and dread onto that which they cannot see, onto the darkness or the night, to sounds and senses that we cannot be sure of, that we fear the unknown as much as we place our faith and beliefs in it. The tone and detail with how the Emperor explains Uriah's fixation on the lightning stone being something of divine power somewhat mirrors that of Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, years later, and it's easy for us to see how the Emperor had imbued these preconceived perceptions into his Primarch's sons and his legions. If we take for example the traitor Astartes of the Word-Bearers, even in the earliest days of the heresy, they would, in the presence of a demon who had shown them powerfully disturbing visions, still display levels of disbelief and flippancy. The Emperor had so carefully taught them into not being so easily able to accept such things at face value, to dismiss out of hand that they could possibly be the truth. Yet in time their ignorance would be their Achilles' heel, and would lead them to become open to accepting what is known to the creatures of the warp as the primordial truth. Argyltal didn't reach for his weapon. Instead he laughed. "You are an insane creature. This is the respect you show to a messenger of the gods? What did you expect? That the Word-Bearers would kneel and accept everything you said as divine mandate? We're done with kneeling, Ingerthal." The resistance of the Word-Bearers to the demon would of course be short-lived. They had already stepped way over the line by this point, but it does demonstrate that, as we know, the transitions and confrontations for many in the traitor legions were not simply about instant corruption, promises of power, or being just casually rolled over by the entities that reside in the Immaterium. We well know that there was bitter fanatical fighting not just between the established legions during the heresy, but also internally among brothers in their own legions. The Emperor spoke with Uriah, who was more and more aggravated by the poking and questioning of this revelation, whoever he was. If I am adversarial, it is because it infuriates me to see the blinkered willfulness of those who live their lives enslaved to such fantastical notions as are contained in that book and others like it. That damnable piece of thunder in your hands, that book, is 9 centuries worth of agglomerated texts and assembled, rewritten, translated and twisted to fit the needs of hundreds of mostly anonymous and unknown authors. What basis is that to take guidance for your life? If a man claimed his dead grandfather was speaking to him, he would be locked up in an asylum, but if he were to claim the voice of God was speaking to him, his fellow clerics might well make him into a saint. Clearly, there is safety in numbers when it comes to hearing voices. Uriah spat back at this abrasive figure that had invaded his sanctum. "This is my faith you're talking about. Show some damned respect." "Why should I?" said Revelation. "Why does your faith require special treatment? It's not robust enough to stand some questioning? Why should you and your faith be singled out for special treatment?" "I have seen God," hissed Uriah. "If you have had such experience, you may believe it was real, but do not expect me or anyone else to give it credence, Uriah. Just because you believe a thing to be true does not make it so." Uriah maintained his account of having seen and felt God himself, and would reference his youth, where by now the thunder armies of the Emperor had already subdued most of Terra. Yet the young Uriah decided he would attempt to find corners of the world not yet conquered by this so-called Emperor with his eagled banners. Yet everywhere he travelled he found only towns and people that were already subdued, giving praise for the Emperor, albeit seemingly with a hollow sense of loyalty. It would not be until years later when he would travel to the land of the Frank and there find a people who had murdered their appointed governor of the Emperor. The townspeople wanted no part of this so-called Emperor's rule, and a hastily organised civilian militia slaughtered the appointed soldiers in their barracks. Iconography of the Emperor was torn down, and the streets became full of happy songs, dancing children, and joyous people at their newly found self-determined freedom. Uriah explained how the mood was optimistic, positive and confident. More towns heard of the uprising and allied themselves with this stance against the tyrannical emperor figure. When all was said and done, they would have anything like 40 to 50,000 men and women ready to fight and defend their position that they owed nothing to this emperor and would not be made to bow down to his threats of violence. Uriah explained how this had been his dream of an adventure, a rebellion, discovering these people willing to stand up to the giant soldiers of the Emperor that he had previously seen march across the world and dominate humanity. Word was spreading that the army of thunder and lightning was marching upon them, and so they would set out to meet it. Their jubilant spirits soared high as they left their homes and towns, locals and children gifting them tokens and keepsakes, filling them with pride and an ever-renewed sense of purpose that ultimately would not last for long. Despite the fact that as they stood ready to face down the Emperor's warriors, they outnumbered them 10-1, their ranks revved up to a fever pitch of enthusiasm by many rousing speeches. But as the first charge went forward and the Emperor's giants stood motionless, a moment of concern crossed the minds and the faces of the rebels. And only when they had crossed half the battlefield did the Emperor's solid wall of giant warriors open fire. The result was instantaneous shock and horror. Their cannon-like rifles created carnage, tearing limbs from torsos, bodies exploding from the inside out in showers of blood and flesh, mentally shattered individuals crawling around in screaming horror, men and women split in half, ruined corpses, sobbing, miserable parodies of human form crawling through the shredded remains of their fellow rebels. Some simply lay or sat confused and stunned from the devastation caused by the first bolts of fire. Whatever these warriors of the Emperor were, they were not men, they were monsters. Uriah recalls falling over bodies split down the middle as if their whole side had been simply ripped clean away. Others heavily wounded were crawling around, begging for mercy, men and women alike staggering in confusion and fear, finally understanding what it is that they had dared to face, perhaps wondering why on earth they had thought that they could win against such warriors. Why had they put themselves in this position? People began to hastily surrender, knowing the prospect of winning the day was an impossibility. The armoured giant warriors ignored their cries and pleas, marching into the blood-soaked battlefield, hacking and brutalizing the severely injured and stunned survivors alike. They began to engage the remaining force that was attempting to disengage from the horror. This was no longer anything that could be called a battle. It was a slaughter by butchers. Before the carnage had ceased, Uriah fled as fast as he could, leaving the screaming, tormented wailing slowly fading in the background. Occasionally, one of the damned must have experienced some extraordinary act of suffering, and their cries were carried high and far across the wind. By the end of it, the massed rebel force was slaughtered within the hour. Tens of thousands of men and women, what was left of them, lay strewn across the battlefield, crushed, ruined, annihilated. Uriah had escaped and lay crying and wounded in the darkness of the night. Seeing a golden face as he lay in his agony was speaking to him. "Why do you deny me? Accept me, and you will know that I am the only truth and the only way." This was his apparent personally experienced vision of God. Revelation, the Emperor, immediately dismisses this as just another instance of humans perceiving what they need to see because of their own mortality, struggling, fighting for life, or seeing some kind of vision to explain away the worthlessness of their own life. But Uriah could not be swayed, and he described how after his vision he fell into a sleep only to awaken, miraculously healed. The shrapnel embedded near to his neck and spine was gone, and he decided as a result of this vision that he needed to travel home. However, upon reaching his hometown, he found that his family had been all but slaughtered and destroyed. His former life was gone, and this was when he would turn to becoming a priest of the Church of the Lightning Stone. Uriah explained how he had wanted to serve God, to spread the word of his church, but the Emperor's forces all but prevented him from spreading his word anywhere, instead spreading their own truth in reason and disregarding any belief of the supernatural. Uriah finally voiced his understanding that he knew why Revelation was here to speak with him, that he was here to offer Uriah to join the new ways, but he was still not convinced. The Emperor would try a different approach by describing historical accounts of atrocities committed in the name of religion. Uriah was still not persuaded. Revelation explained that the tales were universal and typify religious behaviour that has been recurring since the beginning of human history. The record of human experience shows that where religion is strong, it causes cruel, intense beliefs and produces intense hostility. Only when faith loses its force can a society hope to become humane. They would argue back and forth, Uriah maintaining that much of a religion's doctrines and texts are not meant to be taken literally. The Emperor exclaiming that this is surely the whole point, that people will pick and choose, and the subsequent confusion that will inevitably arise from such selective reading amounts to an entirely personal interpretation. Worse, those that do take the texts absolutely literally would usually create misery and death, believing the words in the text to be the absolute truth, set in stone, to be unquestioned and strictly executed. The Emperor would recount more ancient histories, from human sacrifices to wartime horrors committed in the name of religion. Bloody wars where thousands would die. Uriah dismissed this as ancient ways long since forgotten, to which the Emperor balked. He pivoted to a more recent event describing death camps and eugenics committed by Cardinal Tang only 30 years previous to their current time. Uriah had had enough. You fixate on the blood and the death revelation. You forget all the good that can be achieved from faith. If you think religion is a force for good, Uriah, then you're not seeing the superstitious savagery that pervades the history of our world, said Revelation. It's true that just before the descent of Old Night, religion gradually lost its power over life, but like the worst kind of poison, it lingered and fostered division amongst the people of the world that endured. Without belief in gods, divisions blur with passing ages. New generations adapt to new times, mingle, intermarry, and forget ancient wounds. It is only belief in gods and divine entities that keeps them alien to one another, and anything that divides people breeds inhumanity. Religion is the canker in mankind's heart that serves such an ugly purpose. Enough, snapped Uriah. I've heard enough. Yes, people have done things terrible to one another in the name of their gods, but they've done terrible things to one another without the recourse to their beliefs. An acceptance of gods and an afterlife is a vital part of what makes us who we are. If you take that away from humanity, what do you suggest takes its place? In my many years as a priest, I have ministered to many dying people, and the emotional benefits of religion's power to console them and those left behind cannot be underestimated. There is a flaw in your logic, Uriah, said Revelation. Religion's power to console gives it absolutely no more credence or validity. It might very well be a comfort to a dying man to believe that he'll go to some bountiful paradise of endless joy, but even as he dies with a wonderful smile on his face, it means nothing in the grand scheme of things as far as the truth of the matter is concerned. Maybe not, said Uriah, but when my time comes, I will die with my God's name on my lips. There are multiple aspects to read from the discussion between the Emperor and Uriah. For one, it's fairly staggering that the Emperor has the gall to recount the many accounts of religious atrocity as examples of why it's such a flawed and dangerous concept for humanity, and that for this, and also other reasons, it's why mankind is better off without it. He makes these statements immediately after he has just sat and listened to Uriah recount his own tale of facing down the Emperor's army of giant superhuman warriors, versus a force of what can only be read as being a fairly large, yet seemingly primarily civilian force of angry townspeople. That the Emperor's warriors proceed to not only engage with maximum levels of aggression, but then continue to engage in one of the most inhuman slaughters, brutalizing and committing horrors best not even thought of, and not against a defiant, powerful warlord and his army of trained soldiers. No, they destroyed with no mercy a mob of crying, stunned people who knew that they were defeated as the first shots were fired. You can barely imagine a more inhuman situation. Why this level of violence and display of pure, unfettered aggression was necessary has no explanation. And as they knelt begging for mercy, the Emperor allowed his giant warriors to let their bloodlust run rampant as these monsters often literally crushed under their heavy armoured boots anything that moved, until the ground was nothing more than a hellscape, a wasteland of horror. You'd be forgiven for mistaking them for the worshippers of the blood god, for on this day they surely imbued Khorne with a refreshing burst of power. You can only see these events as shockingly hypocritical on behalf of the Emperor. Within almost the same breath he begins explaining how it is religion that is the terrible enemy of mankind because, through its most extreme beliefs, it can on occasion cause humans to commit terrible atrocities. Why Uriah doesn't counter the Emperor with this astonishing level of hypocrisy is frustrating, yet it also highlights to us that the Emperor is operating from a position that is hardly objective or rational. They are simply his talking points to achieve his own agenda, that of removing the very idea of structured religion and spirituality from the human consciousness. As Uriah had now essentially turned his back on redemption and returned to his prayers, a golden light would rise from behind him. He turned to face redemption, but was only able to exclaim, "You!" "Now do you fully understand the futility of what you do here?" said the golden giant. Uriah finally understood, seeing the golden face that he'd seen long ago in his memories as he was near to death, after the horrific battle against the Emperor's warriors. "You are the Emperor." The Emperor tells Uriah it is time to go, and they start to leave the Church of the Lightning Stone. The Emperor begins to explain that the artistry within the church is much like humanity, that it is only meant to exist in the light, not reside in the darkness, that only when suffocating shadows of religion are gone will it be able to see again its true brilliance. Uriah passed through his church as he moved to leave and join the Emperor for whatever fate awaited him. The Emperor all the while telling of how it was that he would create an imperium that would make this church appear like a pauper's hovel in comparison. Uriah transitioned quickly from feelings of regret and that his life had been a misguided lie to a renewed sense of self-belief and strength in his faith, even as confused as it had been. Uriah, in this moment, had a realization. One that the Emperor seemed unable to grasp. For the Emperor had made many mistakes through his past and would make many more in the future. The Emperor is not infallible, flawless, or as perfect as the vision he projects to his followers. Perhaps it's the nature of his origin that makes the Emperor seemingly unable to grasp the necessity for religion having a place in the human spirit. Uriah had allowed the warmth and love of his God to fill the emptiness within him when he needed it most. This was what made faith powerful, that it required no proof, only belief. Its power was in that it needed no understanding at all. He would follow the Emperor out into the tempest that his church had kept shut out until now. But as the Emperor stepped outside, the howling gale blew in, extinguishing his candles. As he stepped out into the thrashing rain and darkness, lightning illuminated the hundreds of armoured statues outside the church, the Emperor's warriors. They stepped forward and proceeded to put fire to the church and throw in grenades for good measure. The Emperor watched it burn. Uriah protested, but it was in vain. The Emperor knew exactly what he was doing and exactly what his plans for humanity were. His Imperium had no place whatsoever for gods and spirituality. Uriah argued with the Emperor over his vision for the future, declaring him a madman as the Emperor laid out his plans to conquer the galaxy. The warriors standing in their presence were only the precursors, he explained. The warriors he was forging would be the generals and lead the greatest crusade to every corner of the galaxy. Uriah protested. "Didn't you just tell me of the bloody slaughters perpetuated by crusaders? Doesn't that make you no better than the holy men you were telling me about?" "The difference is, I know I am right," replied the Emperor. "Spoken like a true autocrat," came Uriah. Emperor shook his head. "You misunderstand, Uriah. I've seen the narrow survival path that is all that stands between humanity and extinction. This is the way it must begin." This was when Uriah would finally see the truth of the Emperor, and tell him that to deny humanity a thing would only make them crave it more so, and if he were successful, to be wary that his followers do not mistake him for a god lest they begin to worship him. Uriah could see through the gold and the blinding light now. This was not a god, for he could see the burning ambition and the white-hot core of violence in the heart of the Emperor. "I wish only the best for my people," promised the Emperor. "I think you do, but I will not be a part of it," said Uriah. With that, Uriah would turn and walk back into the burning church. He walked straight into the blaze as the flames closed around him. Outside, the warriors watched the church until it collapsed. By morning, only smouldering ruins remained. The Emperor turned away, saying only, "Come, we have a galaxy to conquer." The only sound to be heard was the chiming of an old and broken clock. The small clock in this story I've omitted until the end as it has a specific relevance and really a tale all of its own. Uriah had owned a small bronze clock described as having a cracked glass face and clean, delicate hands made of gold with inlaid mother of pearl. Its cogs never turned and its pendulums never swung. He'd stolen this in his youth, where he travelled the earth looking for whatever kind of youthful adventure he could come across, and he'd stolen this timepiece from a silver palace in the mountains of Europa. He recalled how as he had fled this palace, the craftsman who curated the many strange timepieces kept there called screaming after him that the clock was counting down to doomsday and would chime when the last days of mankind's existence were at hand. Uri at the time youthfully laughed off these eccentric craftsmen's bizarre calls and would gift the clock later to his father. But after Uri returned to their home to find his family essentially destroyed, he retrieved the clock, bringing it to the Church of the Lightning Stone, where it would make no sound since that day. Uri had always dreaded hearing its chimes, and he would never have to hear it chime again. The chiming of the clock as the Emperor walks away from extinguishing the last church on Earth is meant to herald the doom of mankind. But why? What is its significance? It's clearly symbolic, as the last church is burned to the ground and the last priest on Earth has engaged with the Emperor. Each gave one another the chance to side with each other's presented opinion. Instead, they both choose to go their own separate ways. The Emperor with his plans for galactic secular domination, the last priest on Earth finally realizing that it is not the existence of a god in the physical sense that is the true power of faith, but having belief is enough, and nothing would make him regret that. This clock, though, appears again in the most unlikely of places. Many years later, Magnus the Red, Primarch of the Thousand Suns, would be overcome with a powerful vision, a vision of things that could never be. Worlds on fire, battlegrounds of Astartes he saw slaughtering each other with blades and fists, landscapes riddled with scars and corruption, battlefields fought at a microscopic level where only bacteria and viruses remained. As he looked through the putrid, nightmarish landscapes, he would find his eyes focus in on something he recognized more clearly, the markings of the lunar wolves and Horus Lupercal. He shouted, but they could not hear him. He would see fragmented and mixed visions of friends and foes, blades striking fatal blows, a strange temple with pillars of fire, and a black pool that appeared as dark as oil. A powerful figure broke through the fractured pieces to coalesce. It was Horus. Magnus inspected it more closely. This thing, it was not Horus. "What are you?" demanded Magnus. "You are not my brother." "Not yet, but soon," answered the monster with a maddening grin. "My brother would never unleash this madness." "Then you don't know him, for it is happening right now. The pawns of the primordial annihilator are already in motion, setting the traps of pride, vanity, and anger to ensnare the egos of the knights required to topple the king." "You lie," said Magnus. "Do I?" laughed Horus. "Horus Lupercal will betray you all. He will set the Imperium ablaze in his quest for power. Nothing will survive. All will become a nuclear cauldron of chaos, from the supermassive heart of the galaxy to the guttering stars in its halo." "Where will this miraculous transformation take place?" asked Magnus, fighting to keep the growing horror from his voice. "On a little moon," giggled the monster, "in the Davin system." "Even if I believe you, why tell me?" "Because it has already begun. Because I enjoy your torment, and because it's too late to stop this," said Horus. "We'll see about that," promised Magnus. Magnus opened his eye, and the Horus monster was gone. Ahriman and the Terminator guards surrounded him, their faces filled with dread. "My lord," cried Ahriman, "what happened?" Magnus shrugged off any help and climbed to his feet. He could already feel the sands of time moving across the face of the galaxy, and he had a brief, last flash of a vision, of a chiming bronze timepiece with a cracked glass face and mother-of-pearl hands. The vision of Magnus couldn't be clearer. The meddling form of Horus is very clearly Tzeentch, especially as it is appearing before Magnus the Red. Tzeentch, the meddling god of change, twisting and manipulating. Magnus could not have known the meaning of seeing the chiming ancient clock. It's really just the mischievously twisted playfulness of Tzeentch at work. And questions remain on who the craftsman back on Terra really was and how he foresaw the accuracy of the clock and its chiming. The two instances are very much connected though. The Emperor himself had a choice. Why did he never warn anyone, not even his prized sons the Primarchs, of the dangers of the spirits, the entities and gods that resided in the warp? His turning away from the Church of the Lightning Stone on Terra as its smouldering remains and all they symbolized were left to ruin was a definitive moment where the Emperor set humanity on a path that rejected totally religion and spirituality and followed only the Emperor's imperial truth. The Emperor had a choice: to bestow his knowledge of the Chaos Gods and the warp to his sons, but forbid them from ever attempting to make any kind of dealings with what inhabited the Immaterium. Now, if he had chosen to do this, you could argue that he would have armed them with the knowledge to know of the manipulating and pervasive nature of chaos and better enable them to avoid its temptations and its corrupting allure. Yet, with that said, has it not been shown time and time again that forbidding anyone in humanity to not open that box that's marked "Do Not Open" is a recipe for disaster? And I believe this was really the position the Emperor found himself in. If he had forbidden his Primarchs from ever exploring and interacting with these beings or explaining to them the true nature of chaos and his plans for humanity, he ran the risk of them being unable to resist the forbidden fruit. It's the oldest tale of humanity, always needing that thing which you can never have. Making something off limits only makes it far more desirable. It's human nature. So instead, the Emperor opted for his only real alternative, to say nothing and hope for the best. Yet this came with its own problems. The Emperor, via the Imperial Truth, did his best to stave off any kind of dangers that might arise from chaos, yet this was nowhere near enough. Not to mention the fact that, as would later be discovered, the Emperor had not only chosen to selectively impart wisdom to his Primarch sons, but that he had carefully misled and actively deceived them. Under the crushing weight of so many miscalculations on the part of the Emperor, the growing apathy and diminishing sense of respect felt by Horus could only lead to one thing. The Emperor's vision for humanity was one of progression, forward-thinking rationalism, a return to science and logic, as well as a powerful sense that humanity were the ones who were best placed to take on the role as the most powerful race in the galaxy. The Eldar had their chance and failed. The remaining Xenos were abhorrent savages. As the Emperor began his galactic crusade, he decreed that his imperial truth be brought to all the worlds of mankind, essentially by any means necessary. Peaceful if possible, by force otherwise. The hypocrisy of the Emperor, given his self-righteous rantings against religion, is blinding. His primary criticisms against religion were that it caused ignorance and horrific bloodshed when humans interpreted things wrongly or with an extreme perception of the teachings from their religion of choice. Yet on so many occasions the Emperor shows almost no regard whatsoever for human life. Far from being a benevolent leader who cares for its human species, because remember, after all, the Space Marine Legions were meant to be a tool to bring about the rise of humanity, not a permanent, ever-present military force that would last for tens of thousands of years. In one sense, the Emperor's grand plans seem to have barely got off the ground before it all came crashing down. Despite his crusade in many ways being a success, the whole vision and mission on behalf of the Emperor in the end was a catastrophic failure. An empire in flames, mass slaughter across so many worlds, return to the darkness of spirituality, persecution, and worst of all, the Emperor in the end left humanity in a position arguably little better off than when he had begun. It's clear to all the Emperor is no ordinary man. Exactly what the Emperor is and just how much power and knowledge he had is always something of a grey area. We know that the Emperor is and was a perpetual, and this has been established in one way or another since the very beginning of Warhammer 40,000. And it's fairly obvious though when you think about the fact that he's existed since the earliest times, no matter which origin story you subscribe to. And I am far more open to the shaman sacrifice origin than I had been. However, I still do like the idea that the Emperor is somehow a creation of some final old one. But full disclosure, there is basically zero evidence for that. It's simply a fun thought out loud of mine. Questionable as well if a single old one could create such a powerful being whilst on the run. The shaman sacrifice though works equally well if you get into the details of it. Really though, the heart of the matter is that the Emperor is an immensely powerful individual. Brand new information. Where we come to the unclear and hazy aspect is just how is he a perpetual compared to others, say Vulcan Primarch of the Salamanders? And this is where we risk going off into pretty heavy tangents that deals with the area of the Emperor's dealings with the Chaos Gods and his acquisition of knowledge to create the Primarchs. The long and short of it is that I do not believe the Emperor to be a perpetual in a sense of how it is often described. The perpetuals are just kind of magical entities who somehow come back to life and are basically immortal. If anything, the descriptions often touted for perpetuals are extremely vague, misleading with very little reference, and this also ties into the very notion of the primordial truth. The original explanation for the Emperor following this shaman account was that the warp was a peaceful and calm realm, a mirror of our material space that existed on another plane of existence. It was a neutral and peaceful life stream of spiritual energy. In the early days of mankind, the warp and the creatures within it had not come to any positions of power. Remembering that the warp itself functions not through some sense of religious worship, but simply by being filled with the natural psychic resonant forces, at this time by more passive plants and animals. The activities of others in the galaxy would undoubtedly have begun to fill the warp with more and more troubling energies, but it was with the ever-growing souls of mankind and their obsessive, guilt-ridden negative energies where the warp really began to fill. On Earth, the primitive humans had developed a relationship with the warp that they did not initially understand, but over time would begin to realize how to use it. Those who understood this best were tribal shamans who could tap into the warp and use its energy to help heal and provide for their tribes. You could also be reborn from the warp and carried forward into new human vessels, and in many ways you can see how these shamans were indeed the first perpetuals. Because they never truly died, they would be reincarnated. And this is depending on how strict you want to be with your definitions. However, as mankind grew and the disturbances in the warp became more powerful and more aggressive, and this was before even the Chaos Gods, the shamans began to discover that they were unable to be so easily renewed by reincarnation. The warp was unstable, it was becoming just more challenging, and sometimes spirits would be lost. Fearing that as time had passed this would herald the end of their kind, they decided after many years of discussion to en masse commit suicide, and as they did so, their kind would be gone forever from the Earth. Yet they would be reborn as one individual, the Emperor of Man. He would not only bear the combined powers of the many thousands of psychically attuned shamans, but also begin to remember their wealth of group knowledge. He remembered that in his rebirth he was imbued with their collective strength so that he might live forever, never again having to return to the warp, which would in the days of the future prove to be far too hostile and too dangerous to allow him to be reincarnated were he ever to die. This original understanding for me is one reason why the concept of killing the Emperor so he can be reborn is a fundamentally terrible idea, but that should probably remain a separate discussion. For us though, the important information from this version of Earth's ancient history is the idea of the Emperor as a perpetual, that this was gifted to him by the collective reincarnation of the shamans of old Earth. Now remembering this, we return to the Emperor standing in the Church of the Lightning Stone. From his own perspective as a perpetual, he cannot fathom the importance or the need some humans have for faith, nor does he subscribe to the concept of the primordial truth, a truth that at this point he surely well knows. The Emperor is not a god in the sense of a god being all-knowing and all-seeing. He is an astonishingly powerful individual to be sure, but he makes a catalogue of misjudgments. He also proclaims to be working for the betterment of humanity as he describes to Uriah outside the Church of the Lightning Stone. The Emperor looked down at him and said, "Some things are best left forgotten." "Then I hope you've foreseen the consequences of a world bereft of religion," said Uriah. "I have," replied the Emperor. "It is my dream. An imperium of man that exists without recourse to gods, a united galaxy with terror at its heart." "A united galaxy?" said Uriah, averting his gaze from his blazing church as he finally grasped the scale of the Emperor's ambition. "Indeed, now that unity has been achieved on Terra, it is time to reclaim humanity's lost empire among the stars." "With you at its head, I presume," said Uriah. "Of course, nothing of such grand scale can be achieved without a singular vision at its heart, least of all the reconquest of the galaxy." "You are a madman," said Uriah. Uriah knew he wanted nothing to do with anything this man had to offer, no matter how noble or lofty his ambitions may be. "I hope in the name of all that is holy, you're right," said Uriah, "but I dread the future you're forging for humanity." And as we heard before, the Emperor replied, "I wish only the best for my people." "I think you do, but I'll be no part of it," said Uriah. There's a large part of wisdom on behalf of Uriah in his final conversation with the Emperor. The Emperor also reveals himself to be a hypocrite and far from wishing the best for his people. He's singularly focused on executing his vision for humanity by any means and any cost necessary. Even if that means the slaughter of innocents, then so be it. However, it appears that Uriah's words may have resonated with the Emperor somewhat, because for as much as the Emperor had declared that his Imperium would operate from a secular position of science, logic and reasoning, there was a strong sense of practices that ran through the Imperium that had more than a flavour of spirituality to them. The terrifyingly powerful presence of his warriors on many worlds were enough to make its inhabitants be awed into thinking they were being visited by some powerful spirits or holy figures. Of course, the iterators would arrive to tell them about the imperial truth and how they needed to follow a secular order, but as much as this was true, it still required a sense of faith. Maybe not faith in the spiritual sense, but faith in the Emperor. And this is really where you get into the muddy territory of defining faith or defining gods and defining spirituality. Where are the lines drawn? Is unquestioning faith in your leader significantly different than unquestioning faith in your God? The Emperor, it seems, knew that he could never fully extinguish the desire for humanity to be awed by things that they did not understand, that they had a need to place their faith in beings beyond their comprehension, and through the belief of the imperial truth, preaching it as a priest conducts a sermon, the Emperor managed to turn his truth into a faith. And just as Uriah had predicted, it was not long before the Emperor's arguably mixed messaging on imposing a secular rule, yet simultaneously himself appearing as a glowing light of golden godlike purity with a shimmering halo and unbelievable power, it doesn't take a genius to realize that quite quickly some of the faithful are going to be more faithful than others. And yet again the Emperor, for all of his apparent foresight and power, could not foresee his own Astartes, first some of them worshipping him, and then slowly sliding into betrayal and finally outright rebellion. The real imperial truth is that the Emperor's war on religion was not singularly about moving humanity from the darkness into the light. The Emperor surely knew that humanity would face as yet unseen horrors. He had at the very least some awareness of these things from his encounters with the Void Dragon, and he knew very much about the gods of chaos. His suppression of religion seems in part on the same track as his ban on any AI development. He knew that the consequences for allowing either could be potentially catastrophic. And it's worth just highlighting something I see far too often incorrectly described. The Emperor didn't oppose religion because he thought that somehow this would diminish the powers of chaos. Why would it? For starters, chaos doesn't work like that. The warp doesn't work like that. The warp is a realm of resonating spiritual energy that mirrors real space, the materium, the warp being the immaterium. So praying to your gods is not going to have some direct, huge effect, and so neither would be removing that. What the warp thrives on and is fueled by is human emotions, ambitions, and desires. This is why on Chaos ships you don't have huge prayer chambers. You might instead find humans or screaming, lashed astropaths to the foul interior walls of their ships, carving demonic runes into their flesh, branding them, cutting them, and allowing their psychic energy and souls to be consumed, their emotions pouring into the immaterium, until their bodies are disintegrating, riddled with black stinking cancers and foul liquids pouring from their orifices. When it comes to interacting with the warp, it's very much a case of actions speak louder than words. And if that means flaying the skin off of so many humans that are captured onto your ship until the deck is literally awash with blood and your entire room is strung up with skins lashed all around the place, then that's exactly what you're going to do if you want to be able to communicate with your demon spirit in the warp. And that is, by the way, an actual example. The Emperor sought to eradicate religion and spiritual superstition because he feared what he already knew, that the forces of chaos lay waiting out among the stars. This is why his arguments to Uriah were so hollow. He had little in the way of sincerity for his specious beliefs. The Emperor knew from his own experience what awaited humanity, and a society open to the concepts of religion and spiritual beings would be far more easily tempted than one who operated from a position of logic and reasoning. Cults and religious sects could empower the beings of the immaterium not through their worship, but by their associated actions. And a society open to worship could easily be manipulated into worshipping a cult or organized religion that was not openly worshipping one of the gods of chaos. It may not have even been aware that it was, but this is how chaos operates: manipulation and half-truths. The Emperor had two choices before him: the path of the light and the path of the dark. No matter his agreements in principle with the gods of chaos, he had chosen the path of light for humanity, and he did not want to end up in a situation where his imperial truth could be surreptitiously replaced by the primordial truth. The terrors of the past had grown in the shadow of superstition and false belief. If the human future was to survive its rebirth, it could not tolerate the delusions of the past. The arguably greatest deception the Emperor ever imposed on humanity was the imperial truth. The truth that was, of course, in fact, a lie. The Emperor knew this was all a lie. He had known this since before the unification, from before the Age of Strife, before the fall of mankind during the Dark Age of technology. The lie being that the spirits, gods, entities, call them whatever you will, but do not deny their existence beyond our realm of perception. It is simply enough, after all, to believe. Some would have it that the imperial truth was never a lie. Mock these fools. Shun them. for they would entangle themselves and yourself in blinkered fallacious arguments and word-splitting games until you both were drowning in self-consuming ignorance, dragged down under the weight of their self-imposed obfuscation. These architects of confusion are to be dismissed and ignored. The primordial truth was simple and clear. The realm of humanity at one time would have called it hell, or the underworld. It was creation's shadow. It was the layer behind the stars. It was chaos, and it was real. To accept the primordial truth is to live in harmonic union with the powers of chaos. It is to accept reality, to embrace power over terror. Without the gods, humanity will die, piece by piece, under the predation of aliens that lay claim to the galaxy. Those who remain will die as the Eldar died, in agony, unable to see the primordial truth before their very eyes. This is fate. It is written in the stars. I feel it's worth reminding everyone at this point that the Emperor, if we're using people's preferred shaman analogy for his inception, was originally produced out of a fear that the warp would become dramatically more hostile, which it ultimately would. That without the shaman's intervention, the human race would be consumed by the spiritual psychic creatures of the warp. Given the origins, it's not surprising that the Emperor would choose the path of light for humanity, as opposed to the path of darkness. At the same time, this image of him as a benevolent protector seems fundamentally misplaced. The Emperor is ruthless, and more than willing to achieve his plans by whatever means. An entirely fallible individual as well. Those worshippers of the Emperor, the most loyal and the most faithful, would have you believe that everything that comes to pass is part of the Emperor's grand plan, or at the very least workable around his long-term intentions. It's difficult to see how that can be true. If anything, the Emperor's persistent declarations that he was just a man, despite all of the evidence of his great powers, seems significantly disingenuous. Yet one feature of him seems certainly true when it comes to assertions, that being his judgment. The Emperor displayed an arrogance that has perhaps always been present in him since his birth, assuming that he could triumph permanently over the gods of the Chaos realm. The Emperor knew of the primordial truth from the very beginning. He had already visited the gods of Chaos millennia before his unification wars, and had begun enforcing his declaration that all his followers obey the imperial truth. Some would say that this was part of the Emperor's grand plan, or that he had some miraculous plan of ascension for humanity. Maybe that he planned in the fullness of time to either starve, destroy, or permanently protect humanity from the gods of the warp. Anything is possible, and we currently have nowhere near enough information to make that determination. But anyone who would at this point put their unquestioning faith in the Emperor should seriously take some time to re-examine the facts of the matter. The Emperor operates from a position of just taking whatever action is necessary. Unfortunately, sometimes that means getting your hands dirty, the end justifying the means and so forth. Desperate times call for desperate measures. But does the desperation of humanity warrant the casual slaughter of so many innocents? Humanity never asked for the Emperor. They were subjected to his campaigns of brutal violence, subjugated. Any resistance to the Emperor's order was met with sickening violence. During the Crusades, the Emperor saw much success and many resolutions without a shot being fired, but there were plenty more where this was not the case, and if the Emperor's abhorrent war crimes on terror were anything to go by, it was no small misstep. I've often heard it said that the situation that occurred with the Interrex was not one of the Emperor's making, yet I ask myself, wasn't it? The Interrex, one of the few empires of humanity to survive the Age of Strife, seemingly intact and in an advanced state of technology, its warriors wearing similar armour to Astartes, and proving more than just a challenge for multiple legions. They had working STC systems. They should have been a bounty and a prize for not just the Emperor, but for humanity. In another time, the Interrex could have potentially been far superior saviours of humanity. They already seemed to have an established rational order of logic and science and reasoning about their culture. The Emperor's forces in the Crusades, when you really look at it, not so much. Perhaps if they had had some way to know what was coming their way, they could have been more adequately prepared and mounted their own crusade, even becoming more successful than the Emperor's forces. It's unlikely, but it's just worth remembering that the Interrex were there and they were doing just fine. They didn't ask for or want to be part of the Imperium or the Imperial Truth. Horus, already turning away from the Emperor, instigated the war with the Interrex, and it's not entirely without the influence of chaos that things ended up how they did. But again, Horus turning away from the light does not leave the Emperor blameless. Given what we know now, it seems the Emperor simply made a terrible miscalculation in not bestowing his Primarchs with the truth of the events that had taken place up to the point of his crusade. Now you can perhaps understand the Emperor's desire to reduce and outlaw religion so as to not give the Chaos Gods an easy win by laying open the likelihood of some forms of worship and the associated acts that would strengthen them in the warp. It's even understandable that the Emperor simply wanted a path away from this kind of superstition and to try to get back to the way things were for humanity during the Golden Age. The Emperor wants to return mankind to its place of power, its zenith of understanding and rationalism. In his efforts to achieve this, it's entirely possible that he was just trying to get there too quickly and taking shortcuts to achieve what he could have done with a longer, more steady conquest. And there may have been in actuality no perfect solution to all of this. The Emperor was doing the best he could under impossibly difficult circumstances. And something I've often heard as well is if the Emperor survived through the Golden Age and had these genetic laboratories and so on, why did he not keep an STC or two to boost humanity back to the Golden Age? This is a very good question, because from how STCs are portrayed, it certainly would have been a quick fix for regaining the lost technology and bringing humanity back from the edge of annihilation. Why the Emperor seemingly did not have any kind of complete STC stored away or in his possession is of course unknowable for us, but we could make a few speculations. As I discussed before in my previous narrative about STCs, despite them being portrayed as the Holy Grail, perhaps in actuality STCs are just not all they're cracked up to be. It seems beyond strange that if they were these holy grails of all human knowledge, that the Emperor would not have thought to himself, I'd better get myself one of these, just in case. Now another possibility, maybe they were rarer than descriptions would have us believe. The war with the Men of Iron, from what we've learned, doesn't sound as if it just exploded overnight. So if things were turning bad again, you might imagine the Emperor would see the writing was on the wall and secure an STC. The other rationale could be that, as I've said, the Emperor is far more capable of making mistakes and his ability to foresee the future is nowhere near as powerful as we're led to believe. Or perhaps he does get very clear visions, but only of very specific events. This is often used as a crutch to explain away the whole heresy and the Horus battle with the Emperor was all part of his master plans. So if you are to assume he knew all, he would have known Horus would betray him and allow events to play out as they did, perhaps for some greater purpose we are yet to see. We could assume that perhaps the Chaos Gods extended their powers to blind or to cover things from the Emperor. We know that very powerful psychic manipulation is possible to hide the truth of things. It's been used on many occasions by both loyalists and traitors hiding ships, fleets, entire moons. Some consider that the Emperor is far more powerful than any can imagine, that all of his actions are according to a grand plan that he's forged over millennia, and that he will still lead humanity to the light out of the darkness, that he will bring the reascension of mankind. How this would be achieved, however, remains entirely unclear. Some speculate that his plan was to lead all of mankind into the webway out of the grasp of chaos, yet this is more than off the table after it was breached and the war in the webway fought, with it finally being sealed as the Emperor is permanently interred on the Golden Throne. If all I have said has not convinced you, then perhaps the Emperor himself will have to speak for me, because when all is said and done, the Emperor could see he had failed humanity. He even admitted it. It's why he was forced to create the Order of the Grey Knights and the Inquisition, and the Emperor described the Grey Knights thusly: one unbreakable shield against the coming darkness, one last blade forged in defiance of fate. Let them be my legacy to the galaxy I conquered, and my final gift to the species I failed. Now, the words of the Emperor here always strike me as especially troubling. It's not his admission of failure that bothers me, it's the words forged in defiance of fate. This suggests that the Emperor seemingly knew that this was destined to pass, that it was inevitable. Perhaps he could see all that was to come after all. He could see what was coming, yet was unable to alter the path, ultimately resigning himself to admitting failure. He had tried to alter humanity's fate, but failed, which returns us once again to chaotic demons speaking the primordial truth, the inescapable truth. The Eldar failed when their test came, but humanity still had the choice to make. That humanity needed to open itself to chaos, as much as chaos needed the more powerfully resonating souls of humanity to fuel it in the Immaterium. The Emperor had already spoken about how dangerously narrow the path of humanity was when he spoke with Uriah, the Church of the Lightning Stone, in their final words. "Didn't you just tell me of the bloody slaughters perpetuated by crusaders?" said Uriah. "Doesn't that make you no better than the holy men you were telling me about?" "The difference is, I know I am right," said the Emperor. Spoken like a true autocrat, the Emperor shook his head. "You misunderstand, Uriah. I've seen the narrow survival path that is all that stands between humanity and extinction, and this is the way it must begin." It certainly seems that before his legions of Astartes had even been completed, or his Primarchs, the Emperor knew that the path they were walking was an extremely narrow one, which had a very limited chance of success. His final act, much like his other decisions, seemed to be that of a man making the best choices he could given the cards he was holding at the time, trying his best to put right what once went wrong. The primordial truth, though, is a troubling issue. In one sense, it's the simple admission that the Chaos Gods and their realm exist. I personally feel it runs much deeper than that. The impression I have had from the demons who have mentioned it is that it's much more than just an admission of existence. It's about humanity being open to accepting what the Eldar could not, that we cannot exist or survive without its help, that like it or not, the destiny of mankind and the Immaterium are inexorably linked. It's a symbiotic relationship that began at the dawn of man. Perhaps the Emperor could foresee the end times through his immense psychic power, and what he saw he could not accept. It set him inevitably on a path to save humanity from the darkness. As he described it, humanity was never meant for darkness. Only in the light can it achieve its full potential. When the suffocating shadows of a religion that teaches us not to question is gone from this world, we will see its true brilliance. In these words, I think we can understand the Emperor's vision. He did not want humanity to fall into the grasp of the Chaos Gods. He had seen mankind at the highest point in its existence, and he had seen it fall. But he knew that no other race in the galaxy deserved to rule more than man. He was obsessed with making his vision a reality, no matter what the cost. This approach unfortunately imbued itself into humanity, where the ruthless achieve your goals by any cost approach would become fundamental to the Imperium's operation. Not forgetting, of course, the Emperor's perhaps unintended consequence of forbidding religion, which would later ironically become one of its most powerful strengths. The Emperor had feared that religious worship and faith would risk destroying humanity by making it susceptible to the beliefs and corruptions of the Immaterium, when in actuality the faith and unquestioning belief in the God Emperor of mankind would become its most powerful weapon. Lorgar, it seems, had been right all along. Religious worship of the Emperor provided a far surer way to bind humanity together than rational thinking and science. The imperial truth would be eroded and people turned to faith. This would ultimately lead to the imperial cult replacing the Emperor's imperial truth, and the Adeptus Ministorum, the ecclesiarchy, would become a powerful component of the Imperium. Ultimately though, while the worship of the Emperor enabled humanity to wield a powerfully binding force that was an anathema to the forces seeking to corrupt humanity, mankind's relapse into state religious worship would in time return it to a decaying, ignorant and superstitious society of ever more extreme positions, where tyrannical leaders and the abandonment of scientific progress halted humanity's advancement dead. Was this the Emperor's vision after all? Not the darkness of chaos, but the darkness of mankind's own inability to disconnect itself from superstition and faith. Such things had left Uriah worshipping a rock in the Church of the Lightning Stone. Perhaps humanity during the golden age of mankind's greatest achievement was not their zenith levels of technology after all. Their greatest achievement was simply that they had reached a time where they were able to step out of the darkness, to abandon religion, spirituality, superstition, mysticism, and faith. They allowed themselves to ascend into a world of pure rationalism, science, logic, and order. Belief in the imperial truth in the modern age of the Imperium was now a literal death sentence. Any heretics who opposed the worship of the Emperor of Man must be purged from society. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Today's video is brought to you by Audible. Audible provides a great service for members that I personally use and why I highly recommend it. It's also one of the best ways to make huge savings on Warhammer audiobooks. Today we're returning to discuss the Emperor of Man, and as part of that I'm considering the details within the audio-only short First Lord of the Imperium. If you've never heard this before, I greatly recommend it, but due to its short nature you might want to consider purchasing this through Audible, as premium members get a 30% discount on audiobooks, and this is generally my preferred option for shorter stories. As an Audible Premium member, you receive 1 credit every month for any title across their entire premium selection, and these are obviously best used on full-length audiobooks. Most 40k narratives are, for example, over 10 hours long. A great many of you in my audience are already using Audible, but if you're yet to trial it, you can start today with a free 30-day Audible trial and get full access to thousands of audiobooks, originals, and podcasts also included in the Plus catalogue. Just visit audible.com/Lutin, and for those in the US, you can also text Lutin to 500 500. Details of my other upcoming selections till the end of this year follow at the end of the video. Time seems to pass by so quickly, and I feel like I somehow have not spoken of anything heresy era for a long time, which is seemingly pretty accurate, as it has in fact been 2 years since we last considered the story of the Emperor of Mankind. In my last exploration of the Emperor, we considered the interpretations of the Emperor via the Last Church in relation to faith and religion and how it sits in a wider context of humanity, plus of course his attempt to eradicate religion from human culture by outlawing all mythical and superstitious belief and worship within the Imperium. This of course later unfolds in the wider timeline of 40k to become wildly ironic, and his actions in seeking eradication of all religion from humanity finally look to be something if not near to, then fully hypocritical. As the story of the birth of the Imperium and heresy have further unfolded alongside the future developments of the Imperium in the distant Imperium of M41, we see that humanity, having fallen back on religion, has moved from being backward looking and against everything the Emperor stood for to now become so important to its very survival. We even begin to see the unbelievable possibility of the Lord Commander of the Imperium questioning both the nature of the Emperor and the importance of religion. It's always difficult to decide a specific area for discussion when talking about the Emperor, because anything you touch upon inevitably will just lead to further questions, interpretations, and speculations. And this is because, despite all that has been revealed, the true nature of the Emperor, his intentions and his ultimate goals, in truth, no matter how confident the theorizing, remain entirely unknowable, and I'm going to restate that many times through this video. Now you might think to yourself, hold on now, aren't I the law orator here, the researcher, and I'm supposed to reveal to you my grand interpretations, lay it all out for you, and say, gather round now friends, I've arranged all the puzzle pieces, and I'm going to let you in on the big secret that you're not meant to know. I could do that, of course, but it would all be a lie, because I've spent many years reading, rereading details, saving relevant quotes and excerpts from novels, shorts, novellas, and all the material that together should bring us firm conclusions. Yet despite this, beyond some vague leanings toward possibilities, which I will get to at the end, the true nature and the core objective for the Emperor remains still completely inexplicable, but I still maintain that anything else is pure guesswork. Now, despite this, I will, by the end of today, try and arrange for you where I think we are at. But that is not the same as laying everything out and saying, I know how it goes, because that isn't the case. Now, are there theories? For sure. There's speculations, guesses, interpretations, and I could probably do videos for an entire year speaking about only the Emperor, because every single sliver of information gives you such minuscule amounts of insight that you feel like you're never truly getting anywhere, and even when they are more clear, usually something misdirecting or contradictory comes along. Not to mention, at this point, you often can't tell if it's a truth, a half-truth, a brazen lie, or perhaps just a misinterpretation of something said or done. Despite all we know about the Emperor, he remains a figure that, unless you're willing to trust his intentions on faith alone, like Malcador, his true nature and intentions are really just as much a mystery as they always have been. Compounding this is the fact that, as you know, I try my best to, generally speaking, operate primarily on the details that we do know and offer my interpretations of the verse and its adjacent themes. I always try to flag when something is pure speculation or not, and clarify things which, generally speaking, appear to be accepted when they probably shouldn't be. Plus, as I've stated many times before, it remains my opinion, and as I've noted also before has been stated by multiple core 40k authors, that in the verse of 40k, the very concept of canon itself is a fallacy. And those are not even my words. The very nature, the very landscape of 40k bucks against the idea of having such sanctioned, standardized constraints almost by the definition of the parameters it operates within. And this is a fact which for many is a cause of much annoyance for the people who enjoy ticking boxes and tidying things away neatly. The funny thing, of course, is that in many ways, as I've said, my life would be a lot easier if everything was neatly sorted and labelled and marked, but on the other hand, also far less interesting. I think a good reference would be, as John French said in the afterword of Mortis, speaking to the idea of current authors still sowing the seeds for future revelations in the 40k verse. He said, "It is more plausible that the stories of the future would not match reality. The people of that time, if they know anything of the Horus heresy, don't know fact. They know stories that have grown and twisted and merged from multiple people and events. How was the Inquisition formed? Who was Moriana? Who was Alanius, the Pious? Who saved who and how? How did the belief in the God Emperor take hold in a broken, formerly secular society? Reality is not clean, and neither are stories." So an unclean, broken society. This is the galaxy of 40k. It's not about things being tidy and clean and easily defined. It's the shattered, twisted remnants of information scattered across an ever-changing reality that actively attempts to distort, twist and manipulate information and facts. The very dimensions of the galaxy itself are actively working against those within it, and even if you only were to consider the Heresy series, it's still over 60 novels. We, as those outside the verse, are then left to somehow try and pick apart the confusing, knotted and ragged threads of a destroyed but rich tapestry and decide for ourselves just what pattern they were originally supposed to form. After some time, I've often thought how you end up starting to feel like Ol P himself. You have memories of events, conversations, things you thought you knew for sure, things that happened, references you read, but then you stop and you consider, wait, were these real? Or were they just badly stored memories, corrupted details of discussions that you in one moment discarded but simultaneously remembered, albeit incorrectly, and then later recalled and blurred that memory with some other piece of information? Sounds overdramatic and absurd, yet I have regularly had conversations with people and or read comments who are as confused as this. Such is the nature of the narrative that forms the 40k verse. So pity the authors who are required to do continuity checks. As I've so often said, 40k as a fiction begins to mirror itself more and more with its increasing difficulty to keep the actual reality of things clean and certain, if it ever were. And then you have the Emperor, which somehow always starts off feeling easy, and then when you start to get into it becomes migraine-inducingly vague, and when you actually reference his recounting, his visions, supposed memories, pearls of inexplicable reference and philosophical wisdom, contemplation. Even when he isn't being vague, you can rarely tell if he's lying right to somebody's face, constructing some house of lies to imprison them within, or if he's telling the truth in such an unbelievably assertive fashion that any individual cannot decide if it were even the truth or not. This is the case all too often when the Emperor speaks with his closest aides and companions. You're never really sure if he's being truthful or setting them up with some web of intentional misdirection. Most of the time, his deepest seeming revelations precede an event that results in a horrifying end for said individual, and so his revelations are some method of preparing them for this fact. Consider Custodes Ra or Malcador himself. This is of course why I presumed he often referred to himself as Revelation. It's occurred multiple times, Uriah in the Church of the Lightning Stone, Magnus, Malcador himself. The Emperor's choice of being Revelation among so many other names I always assumed to be something of an amusement likely to the Emperor himself, knowing his astonishing levels of arrogance, in the sense that he has seemingly never truly revealed his honest intentions to anyone, or not that we've seen anyway in a pure sense, and even when it appears to have occurred, its authenticity or entirety are questionable at best. Whenever a character is speaking with the Emperor candidly, it always feels like someone doing a deal with the devil, where you're trying to figure out what are the extremely important pieces of information that he's not telling you and that will likely cost you your soul in very short order. The Emperor's choice of Revelation also seems applicable as an ironic reference to the Book of Revelation itself, and we know that there is a current attempt in the 40k verse to connect the events between it and the history of ancient Earth, and the fact that the Emperor is believed to have existed in this time, although, as I note, this usually occurs through dreams and singular accounts that I consider still personally questionable. You have Ol P, for example, a long remembrance of himself and the Emperor destroying the Tower of Babel. In this same lucid vision, Ol also references the use of dark, powerful knowledge, laying waste to cities, the Enuncia, till they were nothing but ash and salt. And this very obviously is a reference to the destruction of Sodom and Lot's wife, who looked back upon the city during its annihilation when told not to, and turned to a pillar of salt. So yes, we've come so far in the storytelling of 40k that its newest novels are now making biblical references, which means we really are getting dragged even further down into the cultural and philosophical rabbit hole. My personal thinking was always that the Emperor calling himself Revelation was an entirely deliberate biblical reference, simply based on the fact that it's hardly subtle, and therefore fits entirely for the Emperor, because for as mystical and vague as he is in gifting information towards his ultimate goals, his execution of symbolism and metaphors generally leaves a lot to be desired. But considering this is a verse where Space Marine chapters were decided to number 1,000 Marines and not 10 or 100,000, I probably should let the Emperor's clumsy cultural winks and nods pass by. I'm far more irritated when a planetary battle is talking about having cost hundreds of thousands of guardsmen's lives, but I'm not going to rant about that yet again, or how the fact that hive cities, even with a tiny percentage of conscription, would form guard forces in the millions. But let's put a pin in that. So in referencing himself as Revelation, while interpretations and acceptance vary, overall it is predominantly seen as presenting an apocalyptic hope for humanity, or for true believers anyway. And I think however you may choose to interpret his actions and goals, you'd be hard pressed to come up with a more appropriate title for the Emperor of Mankind than one which alludes to an apocalyptic last hope, but only for the souls who look to him. The most difficult detail for us to unravel in the puzzle of the Emperor is of course his ultimate aim. At face value, everything we know of him points toward him being a benevolent saviour for humanity. He is after all the God Emperor of mankind, the all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful, immortal, moving silently down through the centuries, living many secret lives, struggling to reach the time when those who remain will battle to the last, and I would have done that with a Sean Connery voice, except that I can't. So eventually, after doing Highlander for a bit, the Emperor emerged out of the destruction and chaos and ruin of humanity's own making to lead us onto an all-new time of chaos and ruin. That is to say, the true path of our eternal glory and enlightenment. But somewhere along the way, let's just say, mistakes were made, and now humanity exists on the edge of destruction yet again, over 10,000 years. If only things had been different, if only the Primarchs, the Emperor's beloved sons, had not turned away from him, but of course for the foul corruption of chaos. The damned demon gods of the warp twisted and infected the minds of his sons. For the longest time we believed, and in my opinion the matter is not yet settled, that the gods themselves reached out from the warp and scattered the Primarchs, and in so doing whispered the initial corrupting doubts to some of their number, which makes more sense to me than an embittered companion of the Emperor stealing them somehow and then dispersing them somehow. The early seeds of corruption were sown. These incepted doubts by the Chaos Gods inspired those in the future to throw off their shackles of loyalty to the Emperor and instead align themselves with the ruinous powers, along with several true believing instigators to push things along the way. But so much of what we thought were true now lies even more in doubt. Was it the gods of chaos, or did enraged trusted companions of the Emperor attempt to separate him from his Primarchs in a futile attempt to disrupt this course? This has been precisely what I've been trying to get people to understand about 40k for so long. Things are only true until they aren't. One person's account, opinion, perspective, reference, anecdote is only worth its weight in contextual evidence. When I myself talk about 40k lore, I often try to walk a line between imagining myself in the verse and how that would shape my perspective and opinion, as opposed to purely being an outside observer. This means that I tend to view snapshots of information, stories told, and so on through a very skeptical lens, because we simply cannot verify said person's authenticity. You're relying on the author to be sincere through what a character is telling you at a meta level. And very often in 40k, this is demonstrably proven to be inaccurate. And this often again annoys people, and it has done so with the steady development of certain details in the heresy. Some things that were previously believed to be known events get distorted, things Horus has said, Ol P taking a stand but actually not, scattering of the Primarchs but then maybe not, you get the idea. Why is this important to understand that narratives operate on several levels? It's important because, as I've often referenced before, narratives as complex as 40k are often telling you details and interpretations within wider contexts, usually through an invisible narrator who describes what's happening and how characters are feeling, what they observe, and so on. When a new narrative opens, it's rarely a character speaking, it's an invisible narrator. And so we as the external viewer are therefore not necessarily always able to see things in their complete form. You feel like you do, but that's only if you just accept everything as it appears to be, and some people do really get defensive about this kind of thing. It says X happened, or a character did X or felt X, therefore, because it says so, it must be true. Now again, being skeptical about something doesn't equate to meaning that literally anything goes, and the verse is just a free-for-all. It simply means we have to be cautious about how much weight we give to certain things, because usually there's some truth in most things unless it's a just full blatant lie. Now, not wanting to get overtly technical, but like so many narratives, it's helpful to think of 40k in terms of diegesis. Now all this means is that the narrator tells the story. It's how it's presented to us. Diegetic elements are part of said world, whereas non-diegetic refers to elements outside of the world. In a movie, it might be a sound we as the audience can hear, but characters inside the movie cannot. In fictional narratives, it's helpful to understand the structure because diegesis has 3 levels. There is the extra diegetic level, and you might want to think of this as the highest level surrounding everything, as this is the level of the narrator. They're telling the story. Next we go into a verse at the intradiegetic or just diegetic level. This is the world of the characters, their spoken interactions, their internal thoughts, their physical actions. And then you have inside of this the meta-diegetic level. This is where characters will tell or present a story within a story, for example a spoken anecdote, a dream shared, a vision. Why is this important? To me it's important because I always think of each level being less reliable from the position of an external viewer. And I want to note this is my personal opinion now, not something established or set in stone. I always see the highest level, that of the extra diegetic, as being the most reliable, the author themselves, the individual least likely to lie or misrepresent something deliberately. So for example, if a narrative tells us Horus walked down the darkened corridor, it was cold and damp, I feel pretty confident that I can trust the corridor was cold and dark and damp. If Horus was telling us himself or speaking to another character, at a diegetic level that the corridor was dark, it felt cold and damp, we can trust this fairly confidently. But what other factors might be affecting his perception too? He's within the fictional verse, maybe what he sees and feels is being distorted. Then at the meta level, if someone was merely retelling this, well then you're getting into things like bias, personal agenda, distortion of reality, poor memory, the list goes on. So the point I'm trying to make is simply that when we consume something fictional, but most especially thinking of the 40k verse, it's just important to understand things are operating at different levels of reliability, in my opinion, anyway. Would you trust something a demon said in 40k? Probably not, because it's a demon, and when it's telling you things at a meta level, you know it has all manner of potential contamination issues with the validity of that information. Now an Astartes recounting something is going to be more reliable than a demon, you'd think, but my point is only that we should be cautious at the meta level, and especially within 40k, because we cannot know what other factors are or were at play in distorting that account. But I hope what I just noted helps to see how the path and narrative for the Emperor that has been told was already far from being solid. When did he gain his power? What was his plan? How did he work with Malcador? How powerful is his foresight? The Primarchs were flawed, yes, but intentionally or through lack of foresight. Some were twisted and corrupted to turn against the Emperor, but was it truly the gods of chaos who orchestrated it? Was it the Emperor himself? Is the Emperor truly benevolent, loving father, or a cold, calculating entity as far removed from humanity as the Astartes and Primarchs and demon gods themselves? Many have noted that there is something underneath the Emperor, something behind the psychic veil of power and beauty. John Grammaticus, Corax, Ra, Guilliman, many have seen momentary glimpses of something beneath the veil of his power, something much more cold, much more inhuman. In Deliverance Lost, Corax notes, "Is this your true face?" "I have no such thing," replied the Emperor. "I have worn a million faces over the millennia, according to need or whim." "I remember this one," said Corax, dimly recalling a dream he had glimpsed when overcome by his wounds in the crashing Thunderhawk. "This was how you appeared to me when I was born within my pod." "Yes, it is strange that you should remember that," said the Emperor, his expression becoming sterner. It's very clear that the Emperor hates for anyone to see through to his true self. But why? As I noted at the end of episode 3 in this Emperor series, the primordial truth uncovered the greatest lie of the Emperor. The greatest cost of this lie seems to have been the Imperium imploding into the heresy as unwitting Astartes legions are caught off guard and are thrown into absolute chaos. The galaxy burns, and Calth. As I noted though, there is this deeper, hidden, but I admit speculative truth for the Primarchs and Astartes that he is possibly not their singular father. What I meant by this was our discovery in Vengeful Spirit, the well-known discovery through Horus, that the Emperor visited the world of Moloch, where it is known there is a portal to the Warp long before the Great Crusade itself. Now, as I said, this is far from a new revelation. It's formed the core of discussions for years about the origins of the Emperor and just what he has done in the past or his personal agenda. Now, we'll note in some ways it's actually largely irrelevant because whatever he achieved by visiting Moloch, we know how he ended up, and so much time has passed that any repercussions have already played out. In a real sense, what matters is the modern progression of events in M41 and just what occurs there. Historically though, and specifically in regard to the Emperor himself, it's still interesting and important to consider. This reference to the Emperor's visit to Moloch is something people have often discussed and leveraged to bolster speculations about the Emperor, theories, intentions. It's very important to remember though that there exists little evidence that suggests to us exactly what the Emperor did during this visit. We really only have a reference from Horus, which is likely an opinion and considerably biased, and a perpetual who is seemingly more reliable but also very thin with her information and so not particularly helpful. We're left instead to infer for ourselves, likely very deliberately, what occurred, which has inevitably led to widespread disagreement. Like I said though, ultimately it is somewhat irrelevant at this point. Generally, it is presumed that the Emperor travelled to Moloch and went into the Warp, for this was the only reason for his coming there, but it is wholly speculative that he made a deal with the Chaos Gods. There are vague allusions to him having stolen from the Dark Gods, so many presume this is suggestive of having gained knowledge, which presumably would be in exchange for something or the promise of something. although I would argue power and psychic strength of other powers might equally have been gained as well. We know the Chaos Gods grant this to their champions, Mortarion, Fulgrim, Horus, etc. Now any potential deal or theft might also explain why during the Crusade the Emperor is so urgent to complete his goals. For someone who is so powerful and such a perfectionist, he accepts the degradation of Space Marine genetics just so they can churn out as many as possible to get the Crusade concluded. Now we do know that the Emperor is just frustrated with humanity. He wants to push it forward, and that's one of the thrusting goals that we are aware of. He just wants to move things forward and get on with it. But throughout the entire sequence of events until the end of the heresy, even before Horus turns, there is this immense sense of urgency on behalf of the Emperor, where he's cutting corners and just really pushing the envelope as much as possible, which makes us question if he were not working against some invisible imposed time constraint or some other form of impending deadline. And there is in fact a small sliver of evidence toward this, although it's thin, but it's where Malcador actually says the war began before we were ready. It's never wise to put too much weight into a singular statement, but it is Malcador, and he is speaking specifically of his and the Emperor's plans. Like I say, many have grown to accept the Emperor's speculative bargain with the Chaos Gods as a near enough certainty now within the 40k lore, but it's anything but, it's merely implied. The Emperor may have made a deal he later broke with the Chaos Gods, deceiving them and promising something he had no intention of delivering, or he may have promised them something in the form of a terrible unknown sacrifice for humanity. Is entirely unknown, for it's just as plausible that the Emperor not honouring such agreements are in fact what caused the apocalyptic descent of corruption that caused the Horus heresy. And this tends to be the view of other perpetuals who are known to the Emperor, Ol P being the most notable, who outright made a point of telling the Emperor that his actions may well be what brings the doom of mankind, and that he's just better off staying out of all of it. So this is one possibility, that in attempting to save humanity, the Emperor has in fact forced certain realities to become true, and perhaps entirely unintentionally. This is a very common principle within time, that if you, for example, saw a glimpse of the future, you may feel compelled to try and avoid it, stop something happening by taking actions, but those actions could then inadvertently cause the future you saw, and you'd actually have been better off by doing nothing at all. Except the very fact that you saw the future at all means at that point you probably have already been affected and set on a changed path. This is the whole issue related to time travel and cause and effect and meddling in things and altering the course of stuff. But this is why I continue to maintain that time is an important factor in the 40k verse. I wish it weren't, but I think it is. Horus being shown a vision of the future, real or not, it affects him in a way that changes his actions. And I'm not going to go off on another time rant here and now, but suffice to say a lot of time travel narratives deal with this issue. Oh, okay, just quickly then. Now, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but my personal opinion is that it's fairly clearly established by now that the Emperor is far from the all-seeing individual he is perceived to be. He can see into the future, certainly. He is wise, and he understands humans better than they know themselves, and he is powerful compared to nearly all others in the galaxy, but he is far from being perfect, and neither are his visions and associated plans. He references this heavily when speaking to many of his companions, a prime example being when he's speaking to Custodes Ra in Master of Mankind. "Where you stand now," the Emperor said, "is the present. Do you see the top of the cliff?" "Of course, sire," says Ra. "That is the future. You see it, you know what it is. Now reach it." Ra hesitated. "Now?" "Climb, Custodian. You question the nature of my foresight. I am granting you an answer." Ra moved to the rock face, looking over the stone, finding his first grips. He tested them, finding them strong, even against the weight of his armor. The weaker ones he avoided. Less than 10 heartbeats had passed when a rock cracked and crumbled in his gauntleted hand. Ra skidded, arresting his fall by clutching at the stone. Another gave way, sending him the last few meters to the rocky ground in a breathy cloud of white dust. "You looked for places to safely grip," said the Emperor. "Yet you have already stumbled. You did not know the stone was weak. It looked strong." The Emperor smiled, and it was by far the most unpleasant sight Ra had ever witnessed. Emotion painted across a human face, as false as the grotesques at any masquerade. "Yes," the Emperor agreed. "It did. And you only learned the truth too late." The Emperor then gives Ra another example of seeing a distant shore and trying to get across to there. Curiously, while speaking, the Emperor's eyes glaze over as if he's either lived this moment or considered it deeply many times. He tells Ra of all the things that could go wrong during the crossing, eventualities that were unpredictable, from the ship being poorly built to sea monsters devouring the vessel. And the Emperor describes how each passing moment is rich with 100,000 possible pathways, minute after minute, possibility upon possibility, path after path, all variables you're unable to see from where you stand at this moment. The Emperor reached out as if he could crush the coast in his golden gauntlet. His expression was cold in its pale ferocity. I can see the coast, Ra. I know what awaits me there, but I cannot see all the infinite vicissitudes between here and there. That is foresight, Ra, to know 1,000,000,000,000 possible futures, and to be left to guess at the infinite ways of arriving at each one, to map out even one possible eventuality, taking into account every decision that every living being will make that will impact upon the others around it, would take all the lifetimes I've already lived. The only way to know anything for certain, and he trailed off, gesturing to the distant shore, is to reach the other side, said Ra. Now, if you were to believe the Emperor, you come away with the sense that he is unable to see clearly the future, which fits with what we know of 40k, as even the most powerful Eldar seers cannot see the future clearly, as it were. They see more like possibilities, moments in the future, but not necessarily what implicitly happens between then and now. It also, yet again, depends on what sort of time principles you're operating on, and this is where you could splinter off into talking about multiple timelines and so forth. One quick thing to note, multiple timelines does not necessarily mean that every decision possible creates a split into a new timeline, but it may do, or it may not. But truly, this is something for another day. The point is that the Emperor may well be operating on the principle of being a self-fulfilling prophecy, which he regularly fails to note when giving examples of his inability to clearly see how to successfully get from A to B. He sees a potential future vision, but not what occurs in between. Through his actions to prepare for said future, he ends up creating the vision he saw, meaning had he not had the future vision, he may not have taken those actions and therefore not created that reality. An example being, maybe if he saw a vision of the future where the galaxy is in flames, burning, worlds being slaughtered, he may consider the need to try and save humanity, yet in so doing create the very forces which cause the galaxy to be consumed by the fires of war. Now, that's a clumsy example, but it's the basic principle. Now, a self-fulfilling prophecy is a specific type of causal loop, and it need not happen purely from psychic precognition. It could simply occur via access to knowledge or some other gained awareness of the future. It's also worth noting that not all SFPs, self-fulfilling prophecies, are true causal loops. A prediction of something that alters your behavior does not necessarily equate to being a causal loop. That's just normal cause and effect. Like if someone told you that wearing a headband while playing sports ball on the weekend would ensure you to score a goal, and so you wear one and you score a goal, the fact that you did is unrelated. There's no loop because it's just something someone randomly determined. Even if you had ignored the advice, you may well have still scored. These kind of non-looped SFPs can go in both directions, in the sense that if someone said to you, well, if you didn't do something, then X would happen. Well, if it happened as they told you, this is not necessarily suggestive of it being a causal loop. It's just like saying to someone, it's going to rain tomorrow. If you don't take an umbrella, you're going to get wet. Well, that may be true and predictive, but it's not a causal loop. The key thing when it comes to an SFP causal loop is that there needs to be some means by which one entity has access to information beyond our four-dimensional verse, namely a future vision. That vision or extra information that causes actions that would in all reasonable likelihood not have occurred were it not for that vision. It could be also some other information, you find a book from the future or whatever. This is what causes the loop, because without the vision you would not have taken the steps to either attempt to avoid or deliberately create it, and thereby not enable the vision in the first place that caused those actions. This is of course another of my irritations with time stuff, interesting as it is, because it tends to screw everything up. And things like SFPs can often stray into territory like predestination paradoxes, backwards causation. Go watch my Dark Origins series for more on that stuff if you like it. The core underpinning idea though of a self-fulfilling prophecy is not actually just knowledge. As I've said before, what is knowing? SFP causal loops are more about belief than they are about knowledge. So, example, if you had a truly powerful dream of some inexplicable event, like say saving a family member from drowning in a lake that your family regularly visit and swim in, but to which you rarely attended, but the vision is so clear you can't shake off the feeling there's something to it, and later somebody tells you, hey, we're all heading up to the lake this weekend, you feel compelled to go, maybe just out of curiosity more than anything. But at the back of your mind, you have this sense within you, this small shred of belief that what you felt was so strong, you feel like it's going to happen. At the lake, some of your family are sitting and standing out on a jetty, you feel more tense than usual because of your dream, then somebody startles you, you spin around knocking the person behind you off, and the surprise causes them to hit their head on the deck as they fall in, quickly they're struggling, you jump in to save them from drowning. Now, most SFP, because of their nature, for people in our normal world where we don't have psychers running around all over the place, it's extremely unlikely, and if they occurred, very inexplicable. I don't know if I would classify maybe very strong deja vu within that category, but perhaps. Importantly though, in this example, it's not the knowledge of the dream that's important. Like I said, we all have dreams about things that may or may not happen. It's the person who had the dream's unshakable feeling, their belief, that causes them to take an action they ordinarily may not have, and by doing so they end up in a position they otherwise likely would not have been, thereby creating the SFP. As I say, in our everyday reality this kind of thing is not at all commonplace, it's more just a theoretical musing on the nature of such things. But within something like the 40k verse, this stuff becomes far more applicable, especially when you're talking about beings like demons of the warp, alien seers, bizarre entities like the Emperor of Mankind. To go any further, we'd have to start talking about closed time loops, backwards causation, eternalism, origins of information, paradoxes, various other philosophical ideas, all very interesting, but not for today. Now, in relation to the Emperor, the most important thing for me is, what does this tell us about the Emperor's intentions? Well, most importantly, it tells us that he has likely caused much of what has occurred, directly or indirectly, and it also tells us that he's likely playing a very long game. Although side reference, much like Star Wars, this concept of someone to bring balance to the Force in the sense of, right, but when specifically is that going to occur, feels very similar to the concept of the Emperor saving humanity. Everybody obviously presumes the Emperor was trying to save humanity prior to the Horus Heresy. Everybody presumes this was his grand plan, and that he failed. Except, what if it weren't? What if this were all part of his vision still, and that he knew from the beginning he would be interred on the Golden Throne? He knew that in fact the heresy was not the point at which he would save humanity, and that this is all par for the course. I believe there is a very real possibility that this is the case, and that in fact the Emperor's ultimate vision, based on the concept of a self-fulfilling prophecy, may still come to pass. There are though many unknowns still remaining, but there are indicators that the Emperor knew of what was to come. For example, the Golden Throne was prepared from the beginning to accommodate massive amounts of psychers to be sacrificed. So why would the Emperor design and prepare the device to do so, if he had every intention of just leaving into the webway or using Magnus to help with the Golden Throne? Initially, the Golden Throne didn't even require the Emperor to be on it all the time, so why, when initially they set up the Golden Throne and the Sisters of Silence bring a load of psychers to be sacrificed to the Golden Throne, the Sisters note how, even in that first instance, the psychers being sacrificed only occupy one of 10 alcoves for the thousands that they have brought there, meaning potentially it's going to be 10,000 in the future. But the Sister of Silence rationalizes and consoles herself with the fact that this is only going to be necessary for one day. Of course, that's a lie. It was going to happen for the next 10,000 years. So again, why would the Emperor design and prepare the device to do so if this wasn't going to be necessary, if he hadn't foresaw this was going to be the case? Was it just a precaution? Was it future-proofing? Or perhaps the Emperor's vision thousands of years previous was of himself sitting atop a Golden Throne with thousands of psychers fueling him daily? Horus and some of the other traitor Primarchs, Fulgrim, Mortarion, were upon the planet of Dwell. Horus has discovered some of the population had been placed into cryogenic capsules, 1,000 generations according to Horus. He states to his brothers how everything these people knew is preserved and blended with the hundreds of remembrancers and iterators who came to this world after Guilliman restored it to the Imperium. Horus explains he came to Dwell because he had become aware of gaps in his memories, time that he could not account for. And Primarchs have perfect memories. They recall every moment of every second, every day, from the moment they became self-aware, and so to have gaps in their memory was extremely unusual and disturbing. With so much having happened, and the Crusade being taking all of their attention, this was not something Horus had been apparently aware of until now. But when he heard Robert Guilliman describing the library constructed by the Ultramarines' highest epistolary that had rivaled the more solistic of Dwell's repository of the dead, he realized he had an opportunity to fill the voids in his memory. So evidently, this world contains these shared memories of remembrancers, iterators, and many thousands of individuals more spanning the last millennia. Fulgrim makes an offhand dismissive comment, but Horus presses him to recall every moment. Does he recall all of his battles? Fulgrim confirms, of course, all of it. So Horus asks him, so what of Moloch? To which Fulgrim realizes he too struggles to recall the nature of Moloch. This is less an erasure of memory by the Emperor than it is a manipulation. He has likely additionally psychically distorted their memory so that these gaps were not so apparent. He hasn't just purely erased, he's also bothered to try and cover it up. Huge gaps would be too obvious, so this obfuscation is designed to make them less noticeable. In fact, they start to realize the logs of the Crusade state several Primarchs and the Emperor travelled to Moloch, and it was a compliant world, no battle, no bloodshed. The populace were meticulous in their record-keeping and well-remembered terror, welcomed the Crusaders' unification. So why, Horus wonders, did they remain there, as the ship's logs state, for 111 days, and when they finally left, the Emperor deployed heavy defensive forces, including 3 Titanicus cohorts, Imperial Army regiments, and Astartes Legion detachments. The reason as to why they are there is a mystery, and this is where Horus reveals his discovery. The Iterator in stasis they stand around Varfel specialized in the early history of the Emperor himself, the Unification Wars, the myths and legends surrounding the Emperor and how he took the throne of Old Earth. Not only this, but his remembrances blended with the memories of those on Dwell, some of which go back to presumably before the disturbances of Old Night, that is, the Age of Strife. Horus's masterstroke here is that some of those who exist in stasis on Dwell originate from Moloch and have memories from the ancient times before the Crusade ever began, before the Astartes or the Primarchs were even created. But most importantly of all, some of these settlers remember the visitation of the Emperor's first expedition to Moloch. Horus reveals that the Emperor travelled to the planet of Moloch centuries, or most likely millennia prior to the Unification Wars on Earth, and that his ship was left on Moloch, meaning he used it only one way, but returned still to Terra. Fulgrim remembers this detail. He says how there were cannibalized ship structures left there. What Horus says next seems something of a leap though. Horus states that whatever the Emperor found there made him into a god, or as near makes no difference. And many people see this as a problematic statement. Horus seems to jump suddenly to making this wild assumption, when one could just presume the Emperor used either the warp or potentially the webway to return to Terra. There's nothing that suggests he suddenly had godlike powers where he could just blink across the galaxy. But similarly, the warp and the webway, these are just also a possibility. There's no real evidence for either of these things. We don't really know what happened. The larger question is about the Dark Gods. Did they give the Emperor power or just knowledge? This is more difficult. What's also worth considering is that, as Fulgrim realizes, the power to distort the memories not just on the Primarchs, but of 3 entire legions of Astartes, and you start to get the sense here that Fulgrim is perhaps for the very first time realizing the true level of power held by the Emperor, and that it is by orders of magnitude far superior to anything the Primarchs wield. Now, this whole discovery leads into questions about just how powerful is and was the Emperor. People often say, well, why didn't the Emperor appear at some earlier point in human history? Why not during the Dark Age of technology and so forth? And the thing is, that's always a possibility, but with caveats related to how much knowledge we have about him, we just don't know. The figure known as Ol P, another perpetual, has shed light on this, as have other perpetuals. From what we are shown through their arguably biased and perhaps misrecalled memories, but either way, they're all we effectively have to go on, the Emperor is seemingly not as powerful as he would later become in these ancient times. Just why he became more powerful remains a mystery. This feeds into speculation, as Horus suggests that this trip to Moloch is why he became powerful. Now, as I say, this really is quite the split in the audience of the 40k verse around these details, because Horus also tells us how at the dawn of the Great Diaspora, the Emperor travelled here in humble guise and found the gateway to a realm of immortal gods. He offered them things only a god in waiting could offer, and they trusted him. They gave him a measure of their power, and with that power, he wrought the science to unlock the mysteries of creation. This is a very well-known quote in the 40k verse and is often surprisingly still debated now, because despite it having been many years, we still are no really further forward in understanding some of these details. Horus goes on also to explain how the Emperor had no intention of honouring his debt to the gods. He turned on them, taking their gifts, blending them with his gene craft to give birth to demigods, the Primarchs. The Emperor condemns the warp as unnatural, but only so no other dare wield it. The blood of the immaterial realm flows in my veins, it flows in all our veins, for as I am the Emperor's son, you are the sons of Horus, and the secret of our genesis was unlocked upon Moloch. The gateway to that power is in Lupercalia, far beneath the mountain rock, sealed away from the light by a jealous god who knew that someday one of his sons would seek to surpass his deeds. And of course this all depends on if you want to just accept Horus's version of events. A diaspora, by the way, is a scattering of ancient people from their homeland. Likely what this is referencing is humanity's first attempts at settling the stars, and what that means is that the Emperor likely travelled to Moloch in a non-warp vessel, meaning this is why it was crewed by Perpetuals, as they were the only crew able to live through such a lengthy voyage. We also hear from another ancient Perpetual, Olivia Soraka, who accompanied the Emperor on his long voyage. He leaves her behind to protect the warp portal gateway on Moloch, and she describes in a first-hand account how the Emperor emerged changed from the portal. In her eyes, he appeared to have aged at least a century, but what was for her just a moment. Later, when Horus goes to Moloch, he goes there not for information, not to make a bargain or some clever deal, but for power. He needs to be empowered by the gods. His desire is to be as powerful as the Emperor so that he might defeat him. Some have questioned why did the Emperor in all his power not just seal the warp portal if it was so dangerous? Well, Olivia also considers later how she knew that he couldn't do it. After what he had taken from the realm beyond, it would be suicide for him to draw so near to those whose power he'd stolen. We also don't know precisely who created this portal to the warp realm. Sometimes it's been speculated it was the old ones, sometimes speculated even the Necron. Honestly, we don't really know. The description of it being sort of black, irregular, smooth stone, it's pretty vague. Now, the Emperor gaining power here on Moloch is likely one of the most controversial aspects of the 40k verse. Like so much of 40k, there remain questions about past issues such as if the Emperor gained power here, how could he have dealt with issues like Catan shards in the past, the Void Dragon? Yet we should also consider if the Emperor was so powerful, why did he need to travel to Moloch in a ship at all? Many seem to presume that he can just blink teleport around wherever he wants to, although there's little to no evidence of this. Then of course there's the famous deal with the Chaos Gods, the information he gained to create the Primarchs. But again, this is extremely vague. Horus is pretty specific about it in manners of speaking, but again, do you want to take his word for it? How much is he inferring? How much is he guessing? Just what was it that the Emperor needed that only the Chaos Gods could provide? By the time we get to the period of unification, the Emperor had the vast resources of scientists and soon the Mechanicum working for him, yet he needed also to go to the Chaos Gods to provide the knowledge for the Primarchs. Somehow this seems unlikely, but again, this is something that is incredibly discussed and raked over so much. Some people speculate that he needed the Chaos Gods to provide souls for his Primarchs. Some people say it was just very complex genetic stuff and so on and so on. But here's really the question. If the Emperor so desperately needed this detail of how to create the Primarchs, why didn't he also bother to get other information that was equally difficult, that would have enabled him to successfully create, say, the Black Carapace, which ended up being incredibly difficult and apparently nearly failed the Astartes project? So why didn't he get that too? Really, here's my final thought on Moloch. And note from here, these are obviously my opinions, and primarily I'm of the view that people just get way too caught up on this whole thing. And overall, given the descriptions, even if you wanted to just put Horus's stuff all to one side, it's very difficult for anybody to really say that the Emperor didn't gain something from travelling to Moloch and entering the warp. It certainly seems from the various scattered references throughout the heresy later that those beings of the warp feel like they were wronged by the Emperor and they've got an axe to grind. This is not brand new information. What I think people seem to get most twisted up about is the blunt statement of things like the emperor got his powers from Moloch, meaning like he was just an ordinary person and then when he went to Moloch he became this super being. It's pretty clear that's not the case. I think, as nearly always is the case with people seeking things to be determined definitively once and for all, they get very tunnel visioned and as a consequence kind of end up missing the point entirely. It's very clear to us that the Emperor was already a powerful psyker before Moloch. We know this, there's lots of references, lots of anecdotes, lots of spoken meta character references about it. He likely didn't gain all his power there. But I always think, why could he not simply have become a bit more powerful and also have done a deal? Why is it always spoken of in terms of it has to have been he got all of his powers or a deal? That's what I tend to see a lot. I think in actuality, he probably gained a little of both. But even this is really besides the point, because the point of it all, regardless of whatever the Emperor needed and came away with, his actions accordingly triggered the Chaos Gods to begin to move against him. I think that's clear, and that, for me, is the critical thing, because tick-tock, and that, my friends, is the point. It's not about how much power did the Emperor get from Moloch, that is mostly irrelevant. It's the fact that he went there at all and came away with some measure of something, and triggered a ticking clock, a deadline to where we see the outbreak of war between the Astartes and the Imperium itself to happen ahead of schedule. The clock in the Church of the Lightning Stone, the clock of the eternal gods of darkness, the clock which, as I noted in part 3, is seen not only during the Last Church, but also appears in Thousand Suns, where Magnus is given a vision of the future, where the galaxy is in flames. Magnus, another example also of a self-fulfilling prophecy. When he comes out of his vision, he has this momentary sliver of sight of the same clock in the Last Church chiming the doom of mankind. And I think it's pretty clear that this is the whole point of the Emperor's story. It's about his hubris, it's about the Emperor in seeking to save humanity from disaster, set himself and the Imperium on course for disaster. He started the clock that would chime the doom of mankind, and when the outbreak of the heresy began amid a collapsing of planned events that Malcador references in First Lord of the Imperium, their time was up. So finally we come to First Lord of the Imperium. Now before we go further, there are a few things to clear away immediately. The first is that as an audio short and not a short story, this small but quite important narrative gets overlooked by many. Almost always when I bring it up, most people have not even heard of it, which is very surprising. But just a recommendation from me, listen to more audio shorts put out by Black Library. You never know what you might be missing out on. The second is to reference anybody suggesting that anything that isn't a main novel, i.e. the Heresy series or any other large full-length novel, is not to be taken seriously or as part of the main verse, as it were. This, as far as I can tell, is nonsense, and purely the opinion of individuals. As far as I'm concerned, everything that exists in the 40k verse, including the codexes, supplementary material, comics, anything else that's controlled and approved through GW, and therefore are all applicable and equally valid, because they're all signed off on, they're all part of the same verse. So be it an audio short, a short story, a novella, it's all approved and part of the verse. So, First Lord of the Imperium. The setting of this short is that the heresy has already broken out, and it is looking grim and severe for the Loyalists. They speak about numbers from Beta Garmin coming in, but the actual date is unspecific, remembering the core of the heresy actually took place over an astonishingly short period of time. Malcador is on Terra at the Imperial Palace and has been called to the side of his personal astropath, and initially appears to be simply comforting a dying aide. He's reminiscing to comfort and dispel her fears. Or is he? This is again what people tend to presume. But in truth, what this feels like is less Malcador putting her mind at ease. That only comes at the end. It seems more that Malcador is offloading some of the things that are of a great burden to him upon the only person he can, a trusted close confidant who is literally about to die and will never reveal his words to anyone. Malcador, for example, reveals in First Lord that he is truly ancient. Malcador states that he is in fact 6,718 years, 241 days old. This means if we are to believe him, and again, in this context we have no reason not to, because why would he choose to randomly invent details just for this dying woman, especially one who already knows likely more about him than any other barring a select few? Why? There's no good reason at all for him to invent details that she actually finds shocking and pretty devastating. It's hardly putting her at ease. So the argument that he's telling her what she needs to hear to feel at peace or whatever, it's nonsense. And based on this assertion of his age, we can speculate that Malcador was born or originated in the early centuries of M24. This is interestingly just prior to the Age of Strife, and to put that in perspective, we currently exist in the time period of 021 M3. The astropath is known as Sybil Nyasta, and she voices a theory that many have speculated, that Malcador is being kept alive by the Emperor's psychic power, that this is what sustains him. Malcador explains no. This is quite wrong. In fact, it's actually backwards. Malcador explains to us that he is the last of his order, the last Sigillite. And more curiously, Malcador explains that the Emperor was not the Emperor until he met Malcador. Before he knew Malcador, the Emperor was, quote, only the greatest of many warlords of old Earth. They knew him by a different name. And this is a detail confirmed by Erda later in Saturnine, that the Emperor was known by a different name in the ancient times, although the Emperor himself has said as much many times that he had many names. But again, it slightly is working towards corroborating generally what Malcador is saying. Malcador also reveals that the Imperial Aquila is not a symbol purely of the Imperium and the Emperor. He explains that the Emperor has almost pure, focused tunnel vision on his goal, on his ultimate desire for humanity, which of course we know, and that this focus is so strong that he often forgets to look to the mistakes of the past and not recall the lessons learned. Malcador tells us that the Sigillite Order, by contrast, was created to remember human history, to remember humanity, to preserve. Of course, this is referencing the long period of the Age of Strife, and perhaps even before that, as he is the last of his order. It's suggestive that the Sigillite Order has been going on for a very long period of time. Malcador explains that without himself, the reunification of Terra would have been impossible. That's a pretty big statement to make, and he explains that therefore our future is built on its past. Malcador showed the Emperor why all others have fallen, thus allowing him to build on the stability of Malcador's revelations. Now this is actually all pretty vague, and in some respects not particularly helpful beyond us understanding that Malcador has seemingly provided levels of invaluable counsel to the Emperor and enabled him with knowledge and visions that he himself did not hold, or at least in Malcador's mind that's the case. Malcador, even during the heresy, is of the position that the Imperium cannot hold, but reveals that the Imperium was not designed for the post-humans, but for mankind, ordinary humans, not the Astartes and the Primarchs. This has of course been abundantly clear, and the premise of the Emperor's plan from the outset. After all, the High Lords of Terra, etc., etc. The Astartes are the tools to protect humanity, but it is humanity itself that ought govern. In practice, that hasn't worked out especially well, and again, High Lords of Terra, Vandir, the shambles of Ulchmar, painfully rectified by Guilliman on his return, the list of human leaders in the Imperium proving themselves hopelessly flawed and easily corruptible is endless. And a small tangent just to note that despite all the pretense of the Emperor and the clarity that his creations existed only so as to achieve brief, immediate goals before being promptly and bloodily consigned to history, all in all this has proven to be something of a bizarre miscalculation now 10 millennia down the line. The Emperor also does not seem to view the Primarchs as his loyal and loving sons, but as objects, things, tools to achieve a task, and then be discarded. There's likely a reason why each of them was so specifically different and had very different traits and characteristics. It's because they're there to fulfill a specific role and then be thrown away, just as he did when he slaughtered the Thunder Warriors. In fact, with regularity, the Emperor refers to his Primarchs as it, and only calls them son if they are in his direct presence or he has need to speak to them in such a manner. Otherwise he refers to them in extremely disconnected, cold, emotionless terms. Now again, some speculate this is just part of the Emperor's grand misdirections, but I can't think for the life of me why it would be necessary, because usually when he refers to them as being less than human, he's speaking with close aides, people he can theoretically trust, so that seems to undermine such ideas. Also, Guilliman, when speaking with the Emperor in M41, reveals to us that the Emperor seemed different, cold, not as he remembered, not at all like a father. This is likely because the Emperor, so drained from 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, no longer has the ability, the power to maintain his illusions, and it's why Guilliman walks away deeply troubled, having now seen the truth of things, and again as others have captured glimpses of before. Quite simply, the Astartes were never meant to exist for 10,000 years. The fact that they have no restrained lifespan is not because they were designed to outsit eternity, not because they were supposed to shepherd humanity. It was simply easier for the Emperor Malkador to create warriors with no lifespan because of the nature of what they had to achieve in the Crusade. Crossing the galaxy was no task that could be achieved in ordinary human lifespans, warp travel or not. This simple fact ended up creating the oddity that is the Imperium of Mankind. It's really a freakish creation. It's not by design, but happenstance. The Imperium of Mankind was never meant to exist as it does in M41. Malkador says quite clearly in this story that he can see Sybil is not afraid to die, so he is not at all reassuring her with the information that he will impart. She is in actuality terrified that the Imperium will fail and that too many errors and mistakes have occurred already, plus Horus is closing in on Terra. The doom of all beckons. But Malkador appears unshaken. He tells her, "Believe me when I say this, Sybil Nyasta. This was always intended to be the final act of the Crusade. We wanted the Primarchs to turn against one another, against their father. Be assured, we maneuvered each of them from the moment of their rediscovery, pitting them against one another, stoking their brotherly rivalries with his unequal favour. It was not difficult, no more so than positioning pieces on a Cheops board," which is, curiously, a chess variant played in the June verse. Malkador also notes that those who could not be managed, well, they would never reach the endgame. This is possibly suggestive of the missing Primarchs erased from all records, but it could also be referencing traitor Primarchs. Malkador says, "You fear that the Emperor cannot control his sons, and yet I tell you that this war is the method of that control. The Primarchs have no more free will than we gave them." Sybil answers, "Can it be true?" And Malkador exclaims how his failure was in underestimating the true enemy, that the ruinous powers emboldened their champions, and the war began before they were ready. He talks about how every toll of the bell gives pause to question, was it a death they intended, or another innocent soul they may have saved, and that this is his burden to bear, and that he does so that the Emperor may concentrate on the final battle to come. In his final words, Malkador tells her to fall, and he will catch you. This I swear, give yourself to him, of course meaning the Emperor. As the dawn comes, Sybil lies dead. Malkador contemplates his further thoughts through a bitter and frustrated tone. He considers how the Emperor promised it wouldn't be like this. But most critically he says, "I lied to them to spare their sorrow, even as I envy their mortality, and it breaks my heart. It breaks my heart." Swallowing his grief and loneliness, he lays her hands on her in the sign of the Aquila. Now this short is a difficult one. It's clearly intended to be. Many people dismiss Malkador's revelations, as I noted earlier, but it is the nature of 40k. Information and details are fractured, and even without this revelation, you can largely piece together what is happening. The real difficulty comes in knowing what the overall plan would be precisely. The one thing I feel sure of is that the Emperor wanted to or needed the heresy to happen. It's pretty clear, as Malkador notes, that the Primarchs have all been positioned to agitate and create jealous doubts between them. You see this throughout the heresy, where the Emperor hardly is acting like a father figure, and there's many times where you just think, what the hell, why didn't he just appease and calm down that situation? Instead, he allows these frustrations and jealousies to fester under the surface. But as Malkador notes, perhaps the timing of their plan was off, and this threw things into disarray. Also, it seems plausible that individuals like Magnus were not meant to turn to the Dark Gods, as we believe Magnus was meant to be, if not the power, then the controller of the Golden Throne in whatever role that was going to ultimately play. Again, remembering that before the end of the heresy, the Emperor was able to leave the throne for periods of time. This didn't cause disaster or stop the Astronomicon from working. Again, because the Emperor, remember, he was so powerful that he can control these things at a distance. It's only after the heresy that the Emperor is weakened, and so then must remain on the Golden Throne, aided by continual Psychus sacrifice. Now, a small tangent about that. In the heresy, we see how Magnus is baited with visions of himself being the corpse on the throne by the dark powers to attempt to turn him. Of course, he resists this for the most part, and we know this is another attempt at creating a self-fulfilling prophecy, which kind of is what happens. Although again, just as with the temptation of Horus, how accurate was this vision of the future? Was it the future or just one possible future? And then, like I said, of course, ultimately it does become another self-fulfilling prophecy because of Magnus and another causal loop. This is what makes the end period of the heresy and the Emperor's ultimate goals to us so difficult, because many of the things he planned for appeared to be with a different outcome in mind entirely, but then also not things that he really voiced. A very obvious line of thinking that many people, including me, have considered is, could the Emperor's positioning on the Golden Throne be intentional? Is he trying to achieve ascension to godhood via the now galactic religion of the Imperium? Was this his goal all along? This is, like I say, not a new idea by any means, but it's difficult to see why that would be necessary, given that essentially the Emperor was already a god by any definition up until his battle with Horus, and even in the aftermath for that matter. There's just too much we don't know, so we cannot say what Malcador is lying about also in reference to the First Lord, because we do not know exactly what the Emperor promised Malcador, also where he says, "I lie to spare them their sorrow." What is he referencing here? Saying them could mean a lot of things, but it's most likely mortal humans or maybe Primarchs. I think it's fair to assume that as he's just spoken to this loyal astropath, he is more likely speaking about having to lie to those close members of the Imperial service about how things are going in the heresy or the plan overall, but this also does not necessarily mean that what he is saying, generally speaking, is a lie. There's always a foundation of truth to most lies anyway, after all. But here's the thing, if you were to just take these things at their most simplistic face value, the whole thing makes no sense. We're meant to believe that Malcador told her this grand tale about how the Emperor and Malcador basically wanted to bring down the Astartes because this was their whole plan, and she's meant to be comforted by this horrifying revelation? Why even bother? He could have just said, "Don't worry, Sybil, this is all part of our plan, we will all surely emerge victorious." But no, he tells her this was part of our plan, but now it's all gone tits up. That's a strange way to reassure somebody on their deathbed. It's hardly textbook where you lie and tell them everything's going to be fine and both of you nod understanding it's a lie. The whole point of this exchange is that he gives her a harsh truth, that yes, she can feel reassured that this was part of a plan Malcador and the Emperor forged, but also that it's not going exactly as planned. He's reassuring her by giving her actual truth. The lie is that the Emperor will not be there to catch her. Only darkness and the nightmare of the warp await, and it is this which is what is breaking Malcador's heart. Now I'll play devil's advocate and say, well okay, what if this whole thing was just a lie and the only reason he told her all of this was to save her from the far worse truth that the Emperor and Malcador do not have a grand saving vision for humanity at all, and that their best laid plans lay in ruin now. Everything's gone catastrophically wrong, and at this point they're completely winging it and hoping that they haven't inadvertently caused the doom of all humanity to total extinction and eternal misery in a version of hell. Now I'm not going to lie, that's actually a possibility. But personally, I just don't see it. It's too bleak even by 40k standards, and it's also not really what the story of 40k and the Emperor is about. It also somewhat sets up the Emperor as being an incompetent, bumbling fool. Not to mention, it would also give this short the equivalent of an "it was all a dream" ending. It would be like those Star Trek episodes where everybody dies, and at the end they're like, haha, not really. I just think the premise of Malcador laying out all this stuff, and then saying, actually, it was all a lie, however you want to cut it, it just doesn't work for me. The much more telling revelation is when Malcador says, "You promised me it wouldn't be like this," in reference of course to himself and the Emperor. I think if anything, this is what helps the most to confirm what he just revealed, because again, otherwise it doesn't make any sense that the Emperor and Malcador had planned things with a grandiose scheme, but that the Emperor perhaps promised things wouldn't be as catastrophic as they ended up being. That fits perfectly. Why would he say that to himself if that wasn't the case? It wouldn't make any sense. Also, when Malcador tells Sybil that the war began before we were ready. As I noted earlier, I believe this to be a reference to the Chaos Gods pressuring them, perhaps having realised just what the Emperor was up to, or just part of some larger timeline and wanting to close things down now as quickly as possible. And that fits within, generally speaking, the wider picture of what we know. And beyond this, of course, in the wider sense, there remain many other heavy questions about figures like the King in Yellow, now believed to be Constantine Valdor. We know this via the Eisenhorn, Raven and Bequin novels. This is of course talking about the Cognate, and we learned that the King seeks to obtain the true name of the Emperor in order to obtain power over him. Precisely why and for what reason is unknown. We also know he has an army of winged space marines, possibly even Custodes like in Stasis, but again, this is strange considering how Custodes are essentially genetically engineered to be loyal to the Emperor. But if it were possible for Valdor and his circle of the Eight able to overcome this, it's believable that they could be rightly outraged by the Emperor's actions and his plans if they were able to kind of get their heads straight, as it were. There of course exist possibilities that they retain information which also give greater context to their actions, and that's certainly a heavy topic for another day, and likely when there's also more information to go on, because right now sparse is an understatement. The point is, there is a lot that supports Malcador's explanations to Sybil. I believe that most of what Malcador said here is the truth, or at least from a certain point of view. Because, like I say, the alternative makes no sense. Then at the end also when he says, "I lied to spare them their sorrow, even as I envy their mortality." Malcador's heart breaks for the fact that any who die are not being saved by the Emperor, but they're falling into the horror of the warp. That is what he laments. It's why he also speaks about the death of innocence being his burden to bear. And that is why he lies to her, and he tells her the Emperor will catch her, to spare her the sorrow of knowing she, and importantly, all others who are dying, are about to be sent straight to hell. Lastly, Malcador's sorrow that's breaking his heart, likely because he truly believed in the Emperor, and that they were going to be able to save the majority of humanity from a dark fate, to secure humanity in the webway, and thereby guide them into a new age of existence. But for Malcador, the writing is now on the wall. It's clear this will not come to pass, hence him saying, it wasn't supposed to be like this. So to state the exceedingly obvious, when considering the Emperor of Man, we must assume he is playing the long game, perhaps the longest game, for he has walked across millennia and the true scope of his vision remains unknowable in terms of how he perceives time itself. I sometimes heretically question if the Emperor, not unlike demons, has something of the ability to see time from the eternalist viewpoint, whereby he sees past, present and future together, and he sometimes gets visions of the future, enabling him to adjust his plans, but the certainty of such future events, as we've discussed, may not excuse difficulties faced in the present, which to be quite honest somewhat conflicts with that concept of time. But perhaps it's somewhere within that view, or perhaps it's somewhere where there are future possibilities. We've been shown glimpses of the past that suggest it was as far back as the ancient time on Earth that he decided his true path, waiting for an ideal time until a situation presented itself. He would wait, passing through human history, observing, learning, and undoubtedly manipulating. I think the most disturbing and perhaps most telling aspect is when the Emperor chose to emerge as a force for humanity, not during the Golden Age prior to the cybernetic revolt. He appears after this, when humanity is at its weakest, not when it was necessary, but when he needed it. That being when humanity can put up arguably the least resistance to his plans, and when the necessary tools are at his disposal. Which gives me, to be honest, a deep sense of unease as to his true intentions, coupled with the fact that so often when those who know him well capture a brief glimpse of the truth inside, they seem not comforted, warmed, heartened, curious, but shocked, horrified even, and that's of great concern. Malcador says that the Emperor was not the Emperor until he met him, but this does not mean to say the Emperor was not aware he needed to and would also meet Malcador. We see many further glimpses of the Emperor Malcador's relationship, example in the short The Board is Set, where the Emperor prepares Malcador for his most critical role for humanity. And by the way, that's the core aspect of that story. There's some other stuff in there, but people get carried away with it. The Emperor's continued deception has left a galaxy racked by war, tearing itself apart. The Empire of Humanity, the Imperium, is holding itself together, but with ultimately near to no forward direction. Was this the Emperor's grand vision, or is it merely a pause? Has he, through his lies and arrogance, doomed humanity itself to a slow death via attrition? As Angron rightly observed, we fight to silence anyone that dares draw breath and whisper a different opinion from ours. We fight because the Emperor wants every world in his hands. For each time I wage war against worlds that threaten the Imperium's advance, there comes another time when I'm told to conquer peaceful worlds that wish only to be left alone. I am told to destroy whole civilizations and call it liberation. I am told to demand millions of men and women from these new worlds to make them take up arms in the Emperor's hordes, and I'm told to call this a tithe or recruitment because we are too scared of the truth. The truth Angron is speaking to, of course, is that the Emperor, like any tyrannical dictator, has enslaved humanity to his will, his unbreakable singular vision that must be executed and followed at all costs on pain of death. And this would then be continued for another 10,000 years under the banner of the all-powerful Imperium, the God Emperor of mankind. Again, was this the Emperor's grand vision? To emulate the despots, dictators and freakish cults of the barbaric wastelands of Earth in the aftermath of the Age of Strife? Or was it for all of humanity to exist in a stagnating, dying pool of despair? The Emperor all along has operated on the principle of going all in on his vision for the future. There was never going to be any half measure in his Imperium, his future for humanity. And that's not my speculation, it's very clear from the beginning when Ol P decided to turn away from the Emperor for this very reason, that the Emperor would allow no compromise, no adaptation, ever. This is later supported by accounts of other perpetuals. The Emperor demands absolute loyalty, absolute devotion and sacrifice, or suffer his unconstrained wrath. The Emperor will destroy and lay waste to entire civilizations across the galaxy that I've often argued, if only they were stronger, retained a little more from the dark age of technology, may well have been able to actually resist the Imperium. And what an interesting galaxy things would have turned out to be then. If of course they were also able to resist the Emperor, but that's entirely another matter. As things stand, there is far too much which remains out of reach to us. Most critical being to discover just what the Emperor's overall plan was, because for someone who set out with an agenda of forming a civilization, a culture based not on myth, religion or superstition, as somebody not wanting to be seen as a god, he surely went far out of his way to do just about everything possible to be seen as one, while telling everybody continually that he wasn't. And if that isn't the ABC of how to form a religion, I don't know what is. So I think it's safe to say the Emperor doth protest too much. I mean, he literally made a Primarch who looked like an angel. Things got so confusing that even one of his own Primarchs couldn't tell which way was up. As always, the Emperor appears as subtle as a sledgehammer to the face. Just a heads up, if you don't want to be seen as a god, don't walk around as a giant dressed in gold, performing miracles and laying waste to entire civilizations. Humans aren't the sharpest knives in the drawer, we tend to let our imaginations run away with us. Like I said from the beginning, the Emperor of Man is nothing if not single-minded, arrogant and unshakable in his vision. He decided upon this path long ago. We have scant few perpetuals to corroborate anything of the ancient times, but they seem to have no major stake in lying. So although their accounts are scant, we can probably trust them. The only question is if they even remember things accurately over 30 or 40,000 years. What we've been told is that upon the ancient Earth, the Emperor was not as powerful as he would become, although it was also told that he was always stronger than the others, than the other perpetuals, the other early psychers of humanity, if you will. And this is fairly important, because slightly more powerful is quite a step from erasing the memories of legions of Astartes, and physically being a guiding beacon for all humanity across the galaxy, and all of the other insane things the Emperor can achieve by the period of M30. Now, we might well consider, okay, this is a very long time, and just as we see other psychers emerging in human history over this time, perhaps the Emperor simply became more and more powerful. However, several things stick in my mind. Firstly, that doesn't seem to have happened with other perpetuals, and also Horus states that the Emperor travelled to Moloch potentially several millennia previous, and that's just his guess. It could have been even earlier. We know that he travelled there with perpetuals, and I also presume this to have occurred prior to the Age of Strife, which occurred in M25. Now, Malcador himself has stated in the early years of M31 that he is 6,718 years old, placing his birth, or however he came into being, around M24, the millennia just prior to the Age of Strife. Additionally, I've always had a difficult time discarding how Malcador explains so clearly in First Lord where the woman he is consoling on her deathbed presumes his extended age is due to his close association with the Emperor, that the Emperor's powers gifting Malcador life beyond that of a human, and Malcador laughs and says, no, you have it backwards. The Emperor was not the Emperor until he met me. So he's suggesting here that something significant occurred between the Emperor and Malcador early on in their companionship. Now, who knows when that is, but it's very plausible that this could have occurred within, let's say, the first 1,000 years of Malkador's lifetime were within the scope for the Emperor to then travel to Moloch. Because let's just go back over this. How did the Emperor know he needed to travel to Moloch again? Did he just know off the top of his head that this place was there? Did he sense it? How did he acquire that knowledge? Now, possibly he would have had access to records through the time he lived through, but it's also possible that somebody told him of what lay there in the depths. The ancient discoveries of human civilization, post-Dark Age of technology. Say somebody who belonged to an order whose entire purpose was to remember critical information. Malkador says, for the longest time, he was only the greatest of warlords of old Earth. They knew him by a different name. Malkador talks of the Aquila's symbolism and how its blindness is not always representative of a lack of sight. In this, I believe he is alluding to things that they do not wish to see, or more importantly, do not wish to acknowledge. He states the Emperor does not dwell upon the past. His attention's always focused on his vision for mankind's destiny. He doesn't want to talk about the untoward things that they maybe did in order to get to here. I believe in my current headspace that Malkador provided the Emperor with the knowledge of Moloch so that the Emperor and other perpetuals would travel there with the express purpose of gaining whatever it is he brought away, which I believe to be probably both knowledge and power. Malkador and the Emperor then began planning their grand scheme to guide humanity into a new age within the webway, as the Emperor has been pretty clear about, and thereby enable us to become a truly all-powerful psychic race and sever our connection to the warp, which the Eldar failed to do. Sometimes the Emperor sounds a little bit more like headed in a Necron direction, but regardless, the big point is what happens with the heresy and the Astartes, and this is really where things become difficult. In one respect, it's reasonable for us to perhaps assume, okay, perhaps instead of one almighty extermination event similar to the Thunder Warriors, the Astartes engage in a more staggered destruction. The Emperor would not have the forces to destroy the combined power of the Astartes, or I presume so anyway. So perhaps alternatively to a large slaughter, some would have had some use in the interim, like Magnus, Dawn, Guilliman, whereas the more unstable, unreliable Primarchs would be twisted into darkness, ultimately destroyed. Except this doesn't work, because Guilliman has had several attempts at killing Mortarion, Fulgrim, and has been readily slapped down to the ground every single time. In fact, one of the few things that saved him was a form of religious intervention on behalf of the Sororitas. So this concept of the Astartes just fighting to the death and basically extinguishing each other, sort of as Malkador states or alludes to, I feel like there is something in there, but the precise details are kind of unknowable. Also, something that never comes up with the Emperor's grand plans. What happens to all the Mechanicus? I have a feeling they're not going to be too thrilled at the concept of having to leave Mars, leave all their cogs, oils, incense and giant robot toys behind. So is the Emperor's plan to really have a huge civil war, and then after that have another civil war? It's hard to really put together in a reasonably logical way once you actually start to think about it. This is in fact perhaps why the Emperor's plan has never been fully revealed. Because the more you put the puzzle pieces together, you start to realize you're missing way too many pieces to make any kind of coherent picture. You've got maybe one corner that sort of looks like something, but the rest is just bits of possible things. Now, do I think that the remaining Astartes and Primarchs would have to eventually be destroyed? Yes, absolutely. It's clear repeatedly that no matter what he says at a surface level, the Emperor has got no care for his creations. They're just tools to complete a task and be discarded. He doesn't consider them human even, because later down the line, if humanity eventually became so psychically developed, what would then be the need for the throne and Magnus and the Primarchs and the Astartes? Also, of course, there would be no need for navigators, astropaths, and so on. If we take Malkador at his word, which for the most part I feel you can, the heresy was planned to some degree, it was schemed to occur. But if that were true, it's also difficult to see how the Emperor's plan could have worked at all. Was his plan to usher most of humanity into the webway, then slam the door shut, put up some kind of psychic bubble around the throne room and gateway, just let everything outside annihilate itself, which it probably wouldn't? Again, to a degree, that kind of seems like the Necron's plans. Go to sleep, let everybody destroy themselves via entropy and awaken to a lovely clean galaxy? In truth, the Emperor of Man seems something of a nightmarish being, but only in the sense that he exists in my mind as the ultimate distillation of a species. When people see through to the core of the Emperor, I always imagine they're seeing something like humanity in its most raw, terrifying form, Or another possibility is, of course, that yes, the Emperor, if we take any number of wildly speculative origin stories, most of those lean toward the Emperor being something not entirely human by any measure of definition. Really, this starts to get into more philosophical terminology because we start to think about things like, okay, what makes us human? How do you define this? Is a Psyker still human? Is a Custodes and Astartes? What is it that's different between a human and a not? Why does that matter? Why does the Emperor care so much about the difference of what makes a human and what doesn't? Why does he care about that? Is it just purely our eternal survival? The more you pull at this thread, the more it starts to become difficult to place just what it is he's so invested in. And that in itself is pretty troubling. And this is perhaps why you have figures like Ol P, John Grammaticus, who have taken this position that the Emperor should be stopped and that humanity should be allowed to take its own course. Of course, with Ol P, that wasn't really his opinion for the longest time and worth discussing another time. But in my mind, the Emperor is more of a tragic figure, so consumed by his own belief, his own purity of vision, his own hubris mostly, that he's unable to see clearly at all that he's very likely doing far more harm than good, even if his intentions are positive, pure, and he really believes he can achieve what seems impossible. A small tangent, in many ways I see the Emperor not dissimilarly to Davros in Doctor Who Genesis of the Daleks, and I'm sorry to throw in such a wild tangent reference, but I really see a lot of similarity, and I'm not talking about Davros in the new shows, but just in this classic serial Genesis of the Daleks. Because Davros, like the Emperor, also seems to have this maniacal obsession to see his species survive. Not unlike the Emperor, he was looking only at the big picture. He saw the perpetuation of his race via the Daleks, also partly himself.
A weakness that will make you give me the knowledge to change the future. You are afflicted with a conscience.
And the Daleks were to be the ultimate genetic evolutionary form, kind of like what the Emperor is looking toward. So to Davros, this becomes the only important thing at all.
I allowed this charade to be played out for one reason only. To find those men who were truly loyal to me, and to discover those who would betray me. I will go on exterminate! Exterminate!
You must stop them!
He will sacrifice everything, even all the souls of his civilization in the current time, to see his ultimate form be perpetuated into the future, because in his mind all of the things in the current time no longer mattered. He was looking at the much bigger picture. Another thought is that the Emperor understood the impossibility of his task and was trying to just walk a line. I've often thought perhaps the reason his goals were not clear is because he was just trying to play the odds, knowing the unpredictable nature of humanity, and that maybe he thought, well, if this doesn't work, I've sown enough seeds in the minds of all that maybe things will go in a different direction that still will help to protect humanity. Say, for example, turning the entire galaxy into a hyper-religious state that spends all their efforts worshipping the Emperor, so much so that it becomes an immense power in its own right. If we think about the Emperor's goals in the most basic terms, his plan was to unite humanity and lead it to a newly evolved state, secure from the most dire threats. Except, if that were true, then why in the hell did he wait until after the Golden Age of humanity, as I said before, to get involved and sort things out? By all accounts, humanity was actually smashing it in the Golden Age, but instead he opted for, no, I'm going to let everything turn to absolute ruin and then start from scratch. As I said, something seriously doesn't add up here, and as many have suggested before, for the Emperor, it might have been a plan to just, save a few functional STCs somewhere, just store them away in a big underground safe in a mountain range, just in case, just on the off chance they're needed. Let's play it safe. This, of course, though, is not the point. The Emperor is meant to be a flawed figure, just like the rest of humanity, and so when he asserts that he is just a man, just a human, not a god, I believe he's actually being honest in how he sees himself. For the humans who look upon him and see this godlike being of immense power, they're only able to see what he appears to be, not what he truly is. The vision he projects is what in part enables him to marshal such respect and awe among humanity, and it's only for those who see through this to what lies beneath do they see the true face, and as John Grammaticus would say, a bloodthirsty bastard. The Emperor's plan, to my mind, however you want to approach it, could never have worked, for the simple reason of humanity. The Emperor had some early success, but even before they were setting out on the crusade, the Imperium was already failing. The hypocrisy was just far too clear to see before things even began. This is illustrated perfectly in Valdor Birth of the Imperium. Kandawire wants to put Valdor on trial for the slaughter of the Thunder Warriors because, despite what the Emperor had promised, that humans themselves would play a strong, actual part in the new Imperium, she quickly discovers that this is not the case. Kandawire remembers stories from her father about Earth as it was. This is what she's built herself around. And so she knows firsthand that humanity was ruled differently in the past. But she begins to see that the Emperor is no different than any of the other warlords and autocrats. In the end, she is vanquished for no other reason than attempting to fulfill her role as the head of Terra's Arbites. Instead, she's told to ignore the outright massacre of the Thunder Warriors and is exiled to live in a small desert camp home, spared execution by the grossly hypocritical Imperial Custodes who sanction her for attempting to carry out the job they assigned her in the first place. And the Imperium would only spiral downhill from here. But it was truly this undermining of the civilian government so early on that exposed and betrayed the truth of the Imperium, that it was purely to be the Emperor's autocracy. This may have been more palatable had he clearly laid out his plans to anybody at any time, but apparently no, this was too dangerous or unnecessary. The Emperor's plan failed not because of Horus or Erebus or any of the Primarchs, not because of humanity, not because of chaos. The Emperor failed because he placed himself at the center of everything, because he believed in his almighty hubris that only he could be the salvation of humanity, and he couldn't bear to share the burden, not even with his most close companions and allies, instead speaking forever in vague riddles and metaphors and stories and tales and all this other crap. His arrogance was his most human flaw, and ironically the Eldar's flaw as well, both so highly advanced, both so certain of themselves that they were perhaps unable to even contemplate the possibility of failure, the possibility that perhaps it was they who were the main problem. In short, when you lay it all out, everything the Emperor did from start to finish was either one of the most deep, carefully laid, visionary plans conceived ever, so much so that because of such visionary levels of genius, even now we still cannot see how it was all meant to work. Or perhaps, far more likely, the Emperor had this vision of where he needed to get to, what he needed to achieve, and was thereafter, for the most part, winging it all the way, trying to paper over the cracks as they appeared and hoping somehow it was all going to work out. The final and far more disturbing plan is that this continues on as some kind of unseen master plan that involves him dragging humanity into the state of miserable decay as it has been for some 10,000 years, meanwhile the Emperor has not come close to completing his goals still, and that this remains just another piece in his grandiose galactic puzzle. Primarch Guilliman has not shared his insight with the Emperor for us. That would have been nice, beyond the fact of course that the Emperor was not how the Primarch remembered him and that this greatly disturbed him. I feel we're unlikely to glean a significant amount of new information from the ongoing heresy, but there are still some aspects to dive in on regarding the Emperor, past and future. Much like Moloch, regardless of how it turned out, the Emperor's grand plan, as far as we're able to understand, as presented, appears to have failed. The only question now is, was this part of a far longer, grander plan that perhaps the Emperor himself was not even able to fully understand the scale and scope of? Will he now, as a figure of powerful worship within the Imperium, empower humanity further? There are signs of this already within the Imperium, as Lord Guilliman is discovering himself. Important questions remain to unravel further, like what of the Cognitae, and perhaps who knows what even still of the Cabal perhaps? What of the Great Rift or Blackstone, of the Necrons' moves in the galaxy, and the Anari? What of the state of the Ecclesiarchy in the Imperium? Could the Emperor be reborn, as many factions of the Inquisition believe? Could he become more powerful than all of Chaos combined? Through the power of the Imperium's God-Emperor religion, permanently fueling and empowering the Emperor to fight an eternal war in the warp, to become, as so many have speculated, a positive god of light in the warp, to become that which he had always intended and enable humanity to be led into a new age of perhaps continued war, but also evolution and enlightenment. I think a short quote from Mortis best summarizes the Emperor in his entirety, where in the ancient past he's speaking with Ol P. The Emperor is arguing that in the interests of humanity, in its far distant future, he should secure some dark, extremely powerful knowledge. The Emperor says, "Take this knowledge and the fate changes. Leave it and it unravels. It is a simple choice." "There are no simple choices," said Ol. "But there are," said the Emperor. "It's just the consequences that are complicated." Now, through one thing and another, I find myself back talking about the Emperor. But in fairness, I think this is a good one, not least because soon we may have some clarity that will warrant a follow-up. Now, for those of you who have thought for the longest time that I were in fact a traitor, a heretic, a cursed spreader of anti-Imperium propaganda who sought to turn believers into the condemned, twist you into followers of the Dark Gods, believers in the primordial truth, you're not 100% wrong. But at the same time, to keep those irritating inquisitors off my back, I'm here to tell you any previous heretical discussion was of course a test, simply a test. Because today I wanted to continue on with some speculations about the Emperor. Because with the soon to be released final novels in the Siege of Terror series, I hope it may bring to us some clarity. With that said, I don't hold any delusion that this is going to wrap up everything neatly, because that's simply not how 40k works, but I do hope it could help put to rest a couple of questions that have been hanging over with the complex tapestry of the older and newer lore descriptions around this time. Now, just a note from the outset, the concept of the Star Child is a contentious one, because of its origins way back in the early lore of 40k, so much so that it's often just dismissed out of hand as a stupid concept, or even that R word. However, I am here to tell you that if you're not aware of it, this line of thinking is firmly back on the table. It has been re-established in one of the newest books documenting the Imperium in M41, and thus it is worthy of discussion, in fact several books. It certainly can no longer be dismissed as old stupid lore that is irrelevant. So I will take the opportunity once again to remind that just because old lore has not been mentioned for some time does not mean it has been passively retconned. Because firstly, it's long established that in 40k even the most cursory of side notes can develop into full-blown lore events, and second because retcon is not a thing in 40k. And please do at me about that in the comments so that I can ignore them. And please do go and see my video where I speak about it specifically, it's linked below. The final battle of the Emperor and Horus has long been the foundation of 40k. It's one of the most embedded events for the verse, and it's something people learn very early on. At face value, it's very straightforward. The end of the heresy, the Emperor teleports to Horus' ship and they fight a brutal battle to the death, resulting in Horus being completely eradicated from existence and the Emperor mortally wounded and then interred on the Golden Throne, where he remains for some 10,000 years to the current period in M41. These events, though, when viewed through a wider lens, leave us with interesting questions, such as if the Emperor did know how the situation would turn out and willingly faced Horus, knowing he would be unable to win, what does that say about him, his intentions and his state of mind? What were the specifics of the battle? Did a Terminator, Custodes or Ol-P interrupt Horus and enable the Emperor to reach a state of mind such that he could obliterate Horus? Was the Emperor holding back while fighting Horus at all? Was Horus's fate actually predetermined by the Chaos Gods and he was merely a pawn? How was the Emperor able to overcome Horus, who we presume to have been empowered by all those Chaos Gods at the time, acting as their avatar in the Materium? Those two things line up. If they pulled away and reduced their power to allow the Emperor a brief window of opportunity, why would they do that? Was this a clever play by one of the Chaos Gods to weaken the others in the Great Game? Or was it that they understood collectively that Chaos would be more powerful in the long term should Horus fall right there? Which brings us to the issue of things such as the Cabal. It's such a brief moment in the entire history of 40k in the Imperium, but the details we can discover and learn from this could grant us a lot of perspective, albeit I must admit probably quite speculative still. Last thing I want to note in this intro, I don't really want to drill down too heavily on the Cabal today. It's a pretty broad and fragmented topic, and for all its details it can be summed up relatively neatly. Plus, not gonna lie, I didn't want to cross-ref it all, plus we've got other things to look at. Because in honesty, the main question is, did the Emperor willingly walk into his own state of perpetual death, both knowingly and willingly? And if so, why? And why that is the main question for today will become clear. To the many billions of Imperial citizens, it is of course self-evident that the Emperor of mankind is the true god of humanity. The saviour of all, the protector, the golden light that will lead us all into the new golden age for humanity, rebuilding the vast galactic empire, exterminating the Xenos threats, purging the traitors, and most importantly consigning the foul and abhorrent entities of the warp, including the so-called Chaos Gods, to permanent and eternal oblivion. How much any of that is true is entirely unknown. We do know that within the Inquisition there are many schools of thought on what the Emperor is and what he is doing. Now, I've looked at these in several previous videos, so I won't list through them all here today, but it's also linked at the end. Within the context of what we're thinking about here, we should at least recall that some inquisitorial ideologies consider that everything the Emperor has chosen to do, up to and including the end of the heresy and the time since, were all known to him. That is to say that he knew exactly what was coming and how it would play out in the aftermath, that everything is unfolding as it should and is all part of his supreme grand plan for humanity. These are the Puritan Inquisitors known as the Amalathians. This perspective gives them significant power because by following this line of thinking, it means that anything they may choose to do is also part of the Emperor's ultimate plan. Now, some may view that more cynically than others, some may practice it in the most complete and sincere definitions, while others simply abuse it to rationalize and enable their horrific personal desires. But this is nothing unusual. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and so forth. Inquisitors as a faction, despite their differing views at a fundamental level, all believe they're doing the Emperor's work. But in the case of the Amalathians, it's more that they would see themselves acting with true moral impunity, because in one respect they may consider that their decisions are predetermined, and that's where I could spin this off into linking it with the whole theories of time from Dark Origins, but maybe not today. Then we have this other interesting and relevant perspective of the so-called Illuminati and the Sensei. This is the whole Star Child theory. Now, these are not members of the Inquisition, these are something else entirely, and I should note that it has been barely mentioned since the 3rd edition, and existed within books that are generally frowned upon, like the Inquisition War trilogy, for example. That's a whole other kettle of fish. But so many for the longest time considered any mention of this Star Child theory to be fanciful nonsense. Old lore that was muddled by the mists of time, and since its early beginnings was barely acknowledged at all. Until now. In both the Dark Imperium and Throne of Light series, which have been documenting the most recent events for the Imperium and Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade, which includes the Psychic Awakening, which saw a massive increase in the birth of human psychers across the Imperium. This has meant a lot more work for the Sisters of Silence and also more fuel for the Emperor. But essentially, as a result of the Psychic Awakening, the legend of the Star Child has been reignited. More specifically, it breaks down like this. A few years into the Indomitus Crusade, visions of a golden infant interspersed with flashes of a radiant being rising from a throne of light began to be reported across astropathic relay networks, spreading out from the Segmentum Solar. Over time the images became clearer, and many began to interpret this with the legend of the Star Child. As is the case with different ideologies of the Inquisition, this concept is deeply problematic for many. And while some seek to enable it to come into being, others fear what it could mean and so seek to prevent it. Others, such as the Servants of Chaos, are actively hostile to the possibility of the Emperor being reborn for obvious reasons, and this is where it gets a lot confusing and very convoluted. This Illuminati, or whatever name they wish to operate under, in Throne of Light they're simply called the Cult of the Star Child. These religious cults await the birth of the so-called Star Child, that's the second coming of the new man, the Emperor, to who they refer to as the Sensei Emperor. The Sensei are the immortal, true sons of the Emperor, sired by him during his earlier life amongst humanity, his real sons essentially. They're said to of course hold very powerful gifts, some psychic, some null, some just masterful swordsmen. And as I said, this is very old lore, but one mention in the 3rd edition, which I should note was a pretty good edition for fleshing out lore, especially its rulebook, describes how in 997 M41, Inquisitor Fortes reported to have discovered a cult known as the Cult of the Star Child, led by a self-proclaimed sensei claiming to be the Emperor's sons. Inquisitor rejected this due to their affiliation with abhumans and the Eldari, and instead suspected that they may be some kind of Tzeentchian cult. They were purged with all but a few of those sensei killed. Now, the cult who are focused on enabling the return of the new man can go by whatever name they want to, but their existence is a lot more vague and in doubt than anything else, especially in the modern Imperium. It's possible they even had connections with members of the Inquisition, which makes some sense because they have beliefs that could align with some inquisitorial ideologies. But this Illuminati are supposed to be called as such because they are said to have been illuminated through having experienced a pretty traumatic event, that is, a demonic possession. They're said to have emerged from it through salvation, and this is the price of membership into their group, to be possessed by a demon, and in doing what seems the impossible, exorcising the demon from their body through sheer willpower alone. It's rare, if ever, for a demon host individual to survive possession, but somehow the members of this cult are said to have achieved this, though undoubtedly this would not be authorized or approved by any within the more Puritan elements of the Inquisition. So in being illuminated to the terror, the horror of chaos, they believe themselves to have gained a new level of understanding of chaos, which is likely fairly reasonable to agree with. Plus they consider themselves subsequently immune to its temptations and corruption. They become untouchable so as to be able to now fight the darkness in a larger perspective. For whatever reason, they have been said to associate with Eldar Harlequins and to have had access to their Black Library. This is the Eldari's vast library of knowledge secured deep in the webway. It's the collection of their complete cultural knowledge and that of the galaxy, and as such the Illuminati understand the fall of the Eldar and seek to prevent the same from happening to humanity. Their experience and knowledge is said to have emboldened them with an ideological perspective that perhaps only the Emperor himself could equally have shared, and they're supposedly similarly devoted to mankind's preservation, with their ultimate goal being to bring about the rebirth of the Emperor of Man. They realize that the Emperor is disintegrating steadily in both body and mind, and that there will come a time where the Emperor has deteriorated to the point where his will finally breaks. Humanity without the Emperor, of course, means the ultimate oblivion, as we will fall to chaos. And so to prevent this, the Illuminati plan to rejuvenate the Emperor by sacrificing his descendants, the Sensei. At the moment the Emperor finally falls, through yet another act of mass sacrifice, the Emperor can be reborn as this Sensei Emperor, to again lead humanity directly. This cult have been said to be influencing events so as to pave the way for the Emperor's rebirth, gathering together also this Sensei, protecting them from the persecution of the Inquisition such as the Ordo Malleus, who know all about them, considering them to be very obviously dangerous heretics, and are therefore devoted to wiping out the Illuminati and the Sensei whenever they come across them. This is just one example of many so-called Inquisition wars which can be ongoing across the Imperium for millennia. And it's also an example of why all the horrors raging across the galaxy, in some respects the Imperium remains in a grumbling, periodically actionable state of cold civil war for the past 10,000 years. And as some have noted, the Imperium and humanity actually spends a lot more time fighting amongst themselves than they do the Xenos, the traitors, the heretics and the powers that would be, despite how often those are presented as the core primary threats. The primary threats to destabilize humanity is actually itself. But most importantly, the Illuminati believe that when the Emperor is reborn, he will wage a final battle against chaos, either through direct war in the warp, or even his rebirth creating some kind of neutralizing effect which will simply rebalance the warp back to a peaceful or mostly calm state. Other theories are said to consider that while the Emperor is dealing with things in the warp, humanity will be left to fight the final ultimate battle across the galaxy to regain control of its borders, with humanity obviously emerging victorious. But all of this remains wildly speculative. The current ecclesiarchy in M41 has begun to preach that the Emperor is stirring, and their belief had some evidence to support it. Miracles have been seen more and more, the ghosts of the loyal faithful dead rising, Imperial saints appearing to aid exhausted armies, readings of the Imperial Emperor's tarot making the difference between disaster and triumph, even reports of the mysterious Legion of the Damned becoming more frequent than was ever seen before. When Guilliman travelled, the warp storms stilled, strangely allowing his armies to make rapid headway. A number of strange coincidences and odd phenomena reached the Primarch's ears. He even witnessed bizarre events himself that he couldn't account for. Things that he would discount at first, but as time went on, he was unable to do so, and became disquieted. All across the Imperium were people having claimed to have been visited or guided by the Emperor than had ever seen before. Many of these were, of course, burned as heretics, but in other cases their words and presence provided succour to the desperate and encouraged those who had no hope of salvation from other quarters to fight back against mankind's enemies. Most critically, all of these seemingly direct actions by the God Emperor have led to an immense outpouring of faith throughout the galaxy, which has only then further invigorated this cycle of emergence. However, there is one small problem, which is that unfortunately it's been noted that heretical interpretations paralleled a belief in the Star Child promulgated by a cult which had been destroyed some years before the Great Rift opened. So the destruction of those attempting to enable the Star Child is somewhat problematic. It also depends upon if you choose to believe or not if these are the Illuminati that have been destroyed, or merely those who heard stories of the Star Child and formed their own cults. The truth of these matters is really unknown, but it does raise for us this interesting prospect of whether or not the followers of the Star Child concept were actually destroyed or continue to exist somewhere out there in the galaxy. In some respects, it could be considered irrelevant. The existence of the Sensei is more strange and not something really spoken to, so just how this may or may not play into things is an open question. But the other question can be, are these followers of this Star Child concept necessary at all? Are they really relevant to what's happening, or is it just the Emperor is doing his own thing and they happen to be just following along and they're not really going to influence it whatsoever? I think what's more relevant perhaps is this description stating that a few years into the Indomitus Crusade, visions of this golden infant interspersed with flashes of a radiant being rising from a throne of light began to be reported across the astropathic relay networks, because this really raises the possibility that the Emperor is starting to stir in the warp, not dissimilarly to how the Chaos Gods were originally born. Now, Slaanesh came into being with one massive psychic explosion so powerful it near destroyed the Eldar and tore a hole through the galaxy, but that's not how we believe the other Chaos Gods came into being, for they became sentient, powerful gods through a more calm, steady coalescing in the warp. Coalescing is your word for today. Which is, in honesty, how the Emperor sounds like he is reappearing, if indeed it is the Emperor. This is where we get more into my own speculation, and so likely best to begin a new chapter. So the very simple concept here is that over 10,000 years the Emperor has been steadily becoming empowered through the sacrifices and worship made to him. So much so that with the birth of the Psychic Awakening and all of that extra faith that's been coming forward, he has finally begun to emerge in the warp, or at least that is how it appears to be. Now this differs from the followers of the Star Child cult and the believers in some other ideologies who think that the Emperor needs to be reborn through actions or directly into a physical mortal shell, or by some other process. The Star Child cult believed that the Emperor's rebirth would be very much an instantaneous thing, where his body on the Golden Throne dies, and at that moment somehow their sacrifices would empower him as he's reborn anew in the warp. My personal speculation is that this is not entirely correct. We can't be 100% sure even if that's what they believe, because I believe that what is happening has the potential to be more troubling, and it raises more disturbing questions as you go along. From here on, we have to presume also that the Emperor is slowly coalescing into some new form in the warp as a Star Child, new man, whatever you want to call it. But essentially you have to assume that's what's happening, because otherwise the rest of today doesn't really make sense. Also, as I noted, these descriptions of the golden infant, some throne of light, those come directly from fairly primary lore material released very recently. So it has legitimacy. It's not some random theory from 20 years ago that can be just pushed aside. These are descriptions that are happening right now. Several questions come to mind though at this juncture. The question of, did the Emperor plan this from the outset? Did he intend to become a figure of worship, knowing that he would be interred on the throne, knowing that he would be steadily fueled by psychers, knowing that he would emerge 10,000 years later at the most critical time for humanity? Essentially, are the Amalathian Inquisitors correct? Is this all part of the Emperor's grand plan, and that things are unfolding exactly as they should? I honestly think it's at least possible, if not very plausible. When we consider the many references from the Emperor, he can often appear quite, depending on who he's speaking with, more enlightened or not. And then you have the shifting views of those who have known him in life outside of being the Emperor. Layered onto that, you have his questionable actions at the inception of the Imperium, the brutal slaughter of humans who might stand against him during unification, the execution of the Thunder Warriors, the cold indifference to his Primarchs, the willful disregard for the genetic integrity of the Astartes during the Crusade, and on and on. And then of course there's other factors like Malkador, the conversations we've learned in stories such as The Board is Set, the First Lord of the Imperium, Malkador saying the Emperor wasn't the Emperor until he met me, and all the conversations we've had about Malkador. Now, I'm not going to rake over all of those specifically today because we've done that. I think the point I want to make is that simply it's unclear what the Emperor's intentions were. It remains very subjective. Everybody will interpret and feel differently about this. It's not bias, it's just you can't know yet. I still think that the pure salvation for humanity may not be the whole picture here. The emergence of the Star Child and what it could mean certainly though raises the prospect that the Emperor in fact knew exactly what he was doing, and that perhaps he may very well have intended to be interred on the throne all along, that he wanted to become a figure of worship, and that the heresy was all part of the plan. We get glimpses of these possibilities, but with the potential for the Emperor's rebirth, with the psychic awakening and the seeming future-proofing of the Golden Throne and Astronomicon, it seems very possible the Emperor set out to become the true God of humanity right from the start. Before we jump further ahead into the last few pieces, I say last few, other half, I feel I should make some reference to the Cabal, because it seems relevant, if not at least to be just an adjacent note in response to this idea of the Star God cult, the Illuminati or whatever they want to be. Basically, these small factions all attempting to force some kind of result in the galactic struggle. So the Cabal are basically a group who have claimed to have fought against Chaos, or in their terms the primordial annihilator, longer than the existence of evolved humanity, a description which in and of itself is somewhat problematic. The Cabal are this strange group of alien species, seemingly all with different origins, some even appearing to be just energy-based entities. Some of their collective species may well have been exterminated by the Emperor's Great Crusade. They also notably contain members of the Eldar. They don't have a permanent home position and instead wander the galaxy. When they do hold somewhere for a short time, these are designated as halting sites, and they may adjust a chosen site of a world using advanced geoforming abilities. The Cabal also appear to have had a high level of mastery over atmospheric alteration technology and the ability to extend or renew life, which makes sense given their war against an enemy that has no concept of time. Their principal ability as a group was that of farsight. Much like some Psychers, the Eldar and the Emperor, they're able to see somewhat into the future, or a possible future, or the predetermined future. Just as the Emperor may have been aware of, they too foresaw that Horus would ignite this galactic level civil war using the powers of chaos, and that this was an inevitability. So why is this group relevant for us? Well, it's only relevant in noting that they provide some substance to the argument that the Emperor may well have known that his outright victory would have been more destructive than for things to play out as they did. In fact, the Cabal's foreseen outcome of the heresy was as happened, the Emperor giving his life to kill Horus, whereby he would become locked upon the Golden Throne. But the Cabal believed this was actually the wrong path to take, for they saw this would lead humanity into stagnation, decay, corruption, and the disintegration of the human empire, which is of course what has happened, thus enabling the powers of chaos who were heavily invested in humanity to grow their influence and power, until finally, after many thousands of years of misery, the galaxy would finally be consumed by chaos, which does seem to be how it's playing out, and there's even suggestion that this is how Chaos wanted it to play out, that Chaos actually even wanted Horus to be killed at the end of the heresy. The Cabal sought to prevent this from happening by forcing an alternative path, if you believe that there are alternative paths to be taken in the 40k verse, where Horus would emerge victorious, and the small piece of his true self that remained within him would stir such conflict that he would end up essentially just imploding and waging a war against traitors in basically a double-down civil war, a final Armageddon. This would mean the extermination of the human species, but the Cabal believed with chaos so invested in humanity, they would ultimately be extinguished with it. They also are the primary cause for the Alpha Legion of Astartes to turn to the side of Horus. John Grammaticus also demonstrated to the Primarchs their foreseen outcomes for humanity, and so they decided ultimately it was a better thing to see the destruction of chaos and humanity than a grinding slow death for human civilization, which would result in the still remaining existence of chaos. However, there are complex issues with this whole situation. Namely, did the Cabal misunderstand their own visions, and through their actions create a self-fulfilling prophecy that by engaging with the Alpha Legion, they accidentally implemented the future for humanity they had sought to prevent? This is one of the complex problems when using visions of the future. By trying to force something to happen, you could inadvertently enable an alternative situation by not seeing the complete picture, which is what appears to have happened. This outcome is of course why the Alpha Legion are still branded traitors to the Imperium and the Emperor, and while their true agenda is not known, it seems unlikely they're playing some complex, long game here. However, if the Emperor did return, I could imagine it being plausible that they could be forgiven and rejoin the Imperium. Maybe. Then, of course, we have the Eldar Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, who has more recently even been offering his services and insight to Guilliman, but he also came to see the Cabal as a threat to the galaxy. He saw their plan to destroy humanity, and in doing so destroy chaos, as a pointless sacrifice that was essentially far too simplistic and also just misplaced. Eldrad stands as one of the most powerful Farseers among the Eldar, and he believes that the Eldar must in fact help the Imperium to be victorious, for the ultimate survival of the galaxy, the Eldar being far too few in number to achieve any serious resolution of the problems with chaos and its continued expansion. Although again, depending on which Eldar faction you speak to, not all agree with him, especially those of the Inari. But by M32, Eldrad had waged a campaign of extermination against the Cabal, and they're believed to now no longer exist. So this is another kind of weird factional thing, where possibly they're still around, but probably not. I just felt it was worth mentioning the Cabal here because their actions demonstrate not everyone agrees with the Emperor's way of doing things. Now admittedly, they're not some breakaway human group, but many of the Emperor's perpetuals chose to just disengage from humanity in many respects, and there are many other groups and factions who actively attempt to shape galactic events. As Eldrad had come to suspect though, it appears that the Cabal did not appreciate the full picture, and that if the Emperor is indeed returning slowly, humanity may still need the help of the Eldar to weather this current strife of the Cicatrix Maledictum and the Dark Imperium up to the point where the Emperor can actually enable a successful re-establishing of the Imperium, essentially. Now, as much as I know some people dislike it, sometimes things are not clear-cut. Sometimes things are open-ended, unresolved, or of course the realization that two things can in fact be true at the same time. The nature of the Emperor's agenda is one such question, and it's a problematic aspect of this rebirth theory because it calls into question the nature of the Emperor. Because if we're thinking about his ultimate goals, being born again into the warp is a tricky one, not least because it makes us to consider, were all the struggles of humanity throughout the Crusade and the heresy and the 10,000 years since all in the service of his ascension to becoming a literal god of the warp? When discussing these things, the Emperor and the Imperium are often given very generous boundaries of moral relativism, in the sense that terrible actions are simply necessary for the greater good. It's often basically presented that this is just how things are and no further action or questions are required, which is very much the default response from the Imperium as well. But if the ultimate goal all along was the Emperor being reborn in the warp, more powerful than ever, can the sacrifices made by humanity, not just in war and service, but also literal human sacrifice through the Golden Throne and Astronomicon, be balanced out? Can these things be aligned as still being good? Or do we start to consider maybe the Emperor was not the only way forward? Maybe he actually is a questionable character. At what point do you start to call it and go, you know what, maybe we need to think about this. Maybe we need to turn back before it's too late. I think there might be a few people who certainly start to realize at this point that maybe he should have been stopped somewhere along the way. But that's really a whole other question. I've often speculated loosely and wondered about those several human civilizations that survived post-Dark Age of technology. They weathered the Age of Strife, they retained a lot of technology from that time. They did not share the Emperor's galactic vision of human subjugation. And I've always thought, and I've often asked, what if they had begun to rise up more ahead of time and created an entire section of the galaxy that was far more technologically advanced? When the Crusade encountered them, they often actually struggled quite significantly against these civilizations, but the Emperor just had far too much on his side, too many legions to destroy these worlds. But imagine if, similar to the Tau for example, they had managed to maintain an area of their own territory, if they had been able to basically build on the technology that had survived the Dark Age of technology, perhaps not entirely dissimilar to the Votan. Maybe at this point they then could have teamed up with, say, the Eldar, the Tau, the Votan, created some kind of alliance which fought against the Imperium. It would have been very interesting, and arguably far more constructive in the bigger picture than the Emperor was for humanity, given the state of things in M41. But of course that didn't happen, but I think it requires us to consider, in admittedly a very basic way, as we don't have time for a philosophical thesis, how do we think about or define things such as good and bad? And that might sound too big of a concept, but moreover, we're thinking about it in terms of somebody like the Emperor, especially when you have entities such as the Chaos Gods, who are often viewed as these abhorrent, completely morally devoid evil entities. But in many ways, they're really only shades away from some of the actions of the Emperor, quite honestly, especially in how the Imperium, ever since unification, has had almost no trouble at all engaging in acts of mass execution, genocide, ignoring wholesale human suffering. Admittedly, not necessarily propagating it very actively, as Chaos may well do, but nonetheless, as I say, it's not many steps away. But is it even possible to make worthwhile moral applications to such an already hellish and morally ambiguous far future, as seen through the eyes of humanity who have evolved, at least socially, technologically and culturally speaking, far beyond where we stand today? Humanity had reached that zenith period only to collapse in on itself to a point of near extinction, but somehow survived to awaken to the light of the Emperor. Thus humanity managed to drag itself up out of the horror. It's fairly evident throughout the story of the Emperor that he takes decisions and actions that are questionable, morally grey, knowingly problematic. But where do we draw a qualifying line of good and bad and what exists between? We know that the Chaos Gods have other traits, Khorne with its sense of courage, martial power and honour, Tzeentch with ambition and seekers of knowledge, Nurgle's acceptance of entropy and rebirth, Slaanesh creativity and pleasure. Although I also often think that while these things are true to a degree, it's very rarely seen in a practical sense that we would understand. These traits really only seem plausible in an almost theoretical or very general sense, almost definitions that are merely a gateway to becoming a follower of the Chaos path. And to give an example, offhand there's often references to these traits being attributed to the Chaos Gods, but it's not often you see a Khorne berserker and think, wow, what an honourable fellow, as he chews through a bunch of civilians with twin chain axes, or you're seeing a crew of Slaaneshi demons turning someone who's still alive inside out and using their ligaments to play some whimsical melody, and as you watch all this you muse to yourself, you know what, that is so creative, I never would have thought of doing that. Tzeentch being attributed to naked ambition, but this just usually translates to disgusting sociopathic human seeks power by any means necessary, and all of the horrifying excesses and suffering that comes with that. So I think in this regard we can question, was the Emperor considerably better? The knee-jerk reaction would obviously be yes, what a stupid question. And I'm not going to lie, I think they are markedly different. But then again, cast our minds back to the Emperor doing things quite casually, such as forcibly subjugating billions to your cult on pain of death or worse, scouring worlds, and then in my opinion, knowingly creating a religion based on you as its deity that would later lead to 10,000 years of grinding human persecution and suffering. I feel like it's not a wildly unreasonable position to take that the Emperor is not a good person. Still, who's grading what's considered morally acceptable or disgusting, laudable or abhorrent, constructive or unconstructive for humanity as a whole? And why does any of this even matter? Well, in one respect, perhaps not at all. In a galaxy as horrific as M30 to M41, clearly what will be will be. In another respect though, it could matter a lot. Especially if you care at all about how we differentiate ourselves from the traitors, the heretics, and the nightmares that exist in the warp, or what fate could ultimately befall humanity. These entities who exist in the warp that are seen by humanity as supremely destructive, abhorrent, evil even, do not necessarily see themselves as such, much like so many innocent civilians who are literally crushed and broken to pieces by the Astartes from the Unification Wars onwards, likely also did not see themselves as acting against the greater interests of humanity. Very often they just wanted to be left alone, and whilst witnessing their loved ones being butchered by gigantic superhuman monsters who seemed basically invincible and completely apathetic to their suffering, in many cases even actively relishing the brutality they were engaged in, they very likely did not look upon the Emperor as their salvation. Later, when the heresy came, many of the Emperor's own came to question his position. Let's take Mortarion as one example. He would come to consider how the cycles of life and death, decay and growth are the most natural states for the galaxy, the unstoppable march of entropy. Why attempt to deny this? Why not embrace it fully? Angron, so consumed by his rage and his suffering at the hands of humanity itself, the failure of the Emperor in his eyes, turned to the only truth and reality that existed for him, and in terms of facing an unavoidable reality, perhaps Magnus much the same. So for us to assume that any who might align themselves with the Chaos powers are seen only as being wrong, evil, because humanity always believes itself to be right, seems really hypocritical. And again, no need to send that anonymous call to your local Inquisition or Arbites just yet, don't worry about it. My point is simply that it's all about perspectives. The Tyranids, for example, difficult really to ascribe emotional descriptions to them as being evil, monstrous they may be, but they're little more than highly evolved organisms looking to consume and maintain their existence, similarly the Orcs. The story of the Imperium and the Emperor are told obviously from the human perspective, but when we look at things from another view, it's not as clear as it may seem. Humanity sees evil in chaos because it's a reflection of the darkest aspects of the human soul and spirit, and so we project our own relative perspective onto them, and because it threatens the ordinary state of human existence, chaos seeks to destroy the default modus operandi of humanity, to distort it so that it may better reflect their own ways, their own truths and reality. So depending on your perspective, this is exactly what humanity does. Wherever it secures territory in the galaxy, it dominates and exterminates all who are not as they. What about the Eldar Maiden Worlds, the beautiful, serene, peaceful planets created by the Eldar millions of years ago? Humanity claimed many of these for themselves as paradise worlds or industrial worlds, and now should the Eldar appear, they're killed on sight. The Emperor and the Crusade slaughtered millions of humans who did not agree with the way of the Emperor, while the Xenos, many of whom were peaceful, butchered just because. Their planet seized, used to farm resources and empower the Imperium, i.e. the Emperor, just like how when Chaos forces transform a world, they use it to empower their specific benefactors. So if we're just talking about it in terms of morality, it's hard to really make a legitimate case for the Emperor as being any kind of moral leader for humanity. For goodness sake, even when his newly established government attempted to act on its own principles and laws that were sanctioned and created as part of the Emperor's new Imperium right after unification, the Imperium of Humanity, they were just shut down, investigated, stonewalled, even exiled. Why? Because it didn't align with the Emperor's agenda. It was just a farce. And so having to face the moral consequences of his actions exposed the extreme hypocrisy of the Emperor, and effectively undermined everything he claimed to be. Those who remembered humanity at this time, the true humanity from before the collapse post-Dark Age of technology, those few who remained or their descendants had the best intentions for humanity. They wanted to build something out of it, to create a new peaceful and constructive human civilization. What happened to them? They were either enlisted and exploited by the Emperor, or they were broken and killed by his minions. So again, not a rock-solid basis, really, for being a benevolent leader, or even a leader who had the best intentions for humanity from the beginning. In fairness, you might think, why is this relevant? Well, it is. It is relevant for me, because I think if we're considering something as era-defining and power-shifting as the Emperor being reborn into the warp, we need to really consider the implications of this. Plus, I think the sacrifices made by humanity should be considered, along with additional questions like, did the Emperor speak to the Chaos Gods after using the warp portal on Moloch? Were any deals made? Why was he in such a rush to complete the crusade? Why was he the Emperor only after meeting Malkador? Why were he and Malkador so convinced things would end in heresy? Was this all foretold, planned, deliberate? Will the Emperor eventually die and be reborn within the warp itself to wage this final ultimate war against the Dark Gods? Or is he just a wounded, some might say even defeated being who came very close to achieving a new zenith for humanity but fell at the last hurdle? Or was it in fact all an extremely convoluted plan, so much so that it were far beyond the comprehension of all than perhaps Malkador? Was the Emperor's placement upon the Golden Throne in fact not a last desperate attempt to save his soul, even if it were believed to be by those around him at the time, but in fact a calculated plan, one that he knew to be a predetermined certainty? We'll talk about this again later, but why were the Astronomicon and the Golden Throne designed to have such massive capacity, enabling them to be powered by so many Psykers from day one, as was observed to us by the Sisters of Silence, who I will remind themselves felt somewhat confused and uncomfortable at the prospect when they began to realise the scale and horror of what was in fact going to be involved in powering the Golden Throne and Astronomicon, that this was not going to be a one-off temporary situation. These are the Sisters of Silence, very loyal to the Emperor, and they were extremely uncomfortable with knowing what they were going to have to do. Not to mention the fact that they suddenly realized that these machines had been designed ahead of time as a permanent arrangement, one that has now been going on for some 10,000 years. This was a big sticking point. They were very uncomfortable about this. So was the Emperor being kept alive by the sacrifice of human Psykers to power the Astronomicon, or were they being slaughtered to feed the insatiable appetite of a new emergent god in the warp? I would point out not entirely dissimilarly to something like the Catan, and the Emperor who has now for 10,000 years been coalescing to join the great game among the other gods and fight for ultimate supremacy. All of these questions drag me back to the Emperor and either his continued state of amorality or moral relativism. Essentially his constant positioning of doing questionable, very ethically bad actions, but balanced with good intentions of the bigger picture. Basically saying, trust me, this is all in your best interests. But at some point you have to say, there's a lot of trust that you have to give, like how far down the road do you go? At a very simplistic level, it could be boiled down to thought examples such as the classic, is the sacrifice of one innocent person worth the lives of many others? And then of course the Imperium scales this up to, is the daily sacrifice of thousands just for the Golden Throne and Astronomicon worth the lives of many billions across the galaxy? Now some would say immediately yes, but I think in all honesty, it's a more complex and challenging position to argue. Not least because these people are not even willing volunteers, they're usually rounded up by the Sisters of Silence, forcibly executed very painfully for the cause of the Imperium, which is pretty dark. So I'll say it again, I just think if we're going to consider the Emperor ascending to godhood, one has to surely question, what kind of god is he going to be? Does he have humanity at heart, or are they just peons and some means to an end? Because I don't know about you, but while many might just presume at face value that the Emperor is going to emerge as this benevolent champion, the avatar of humanity who will once and for all banish all of our enemies into oblivion, if we just look at his previous employment notes, it's not an unblemished glowing record, is it? I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to be concerned, at least, that the Emperor has some pretty morally questionable tendencies, and I wouldn't be completely shocked if he as a newly reborn warp god started just purging anybody who doesn't worship him completely and scouring millions of people from human planets, because let's face it, he's pretty much done that already once before. The Emperor who deployed his superhuman monstrosities to just scour entire worlds, who dared to even just resist joining the Imperium. Those who would not bow down and pledge their allegiance to the gigantic godlike golden Emperor, just slaughtered. I mean, look at what happens in the Imperium with the Ecclesiarchy in Sororitas as it is, their horrifying methods to purge heretics. So yeah, it's not unreasonable to consider that if Emperor 2 arrives, we might likely see that stuff scaled up significantly, as the Emperor has become a god of the warp. Even if he doesn't dictate that it has to happen, probably the Ecclesiarchy is just going to go crazy and just start doing it left, right and centre. Or possibly the opposite, I suppose. Maybe there's going to be some immense outpouring of faith and worship and everything will be beautiful and happy. But I really don't think so. Now, I know that I'm going to get people now saying to me, you filthy heretic Luton, how dare you question the Emperor's glorious return to save us all? He was not some malevolent entity, you've got it so wrong. He didn't have cynical intentions for humanity. He'll be our saviour always. Well, I'm sorry, but it's just that somehow I find it hard to accept that with all the evidence to hand, plus the fact that the all-seeing, all-knowing master of mankind, who had seemingly benefited from one of his most powerful tools, his clarity of vision, until the final days of the Crusade, but then was suddenly brain-fogged, leaving him gambling, unsure of what to do, ending up with this catastrophic clangor of being trapped on his golden life support throne, something just feels off about it. Of course, the easy, low-hanging fruit answer would be the Chaos Gods started getting very anxious that the Emperor might succeed. They threw everything at him, including obfuscating his vision, which always leads me to the thought of, okay, so why did the Emperor then not foresee that? Even without foresight, anybody could see that coming. The Emperor was not like the rest of ignorant humanity. He wasn't like his Primarchs. He knew before all the dangers and horrors which existed within the warp, and I'll refrain from straying off into discussing the nature of the warp and time in 40k and how causality could have been a complicating factor. But what are we being asked to believe here? That the Emperor of Mankind just didn't expect the gods of chaos to do anything? Especially considering that from what we are vaguely led to believe, he already perhaps had an encounter with the gods in the past prior to his crusade, and we've covered this, but it doesn't seem to me that he really gained any power. The timelines don't line up on that. But he may well have gained some lost knowledge from the zenith of humanity, perhaps the ability to tether souls to his Primarchs, which seems particularly plausible considering the complexity of Magnus. And again, as I've discussed before, souls are a curious thing in 40k. Eldar souls, seemingly more persistent and malleable than humans, and some want to make the argument also that maybe the Emperor is some kind of tool left over from the golden age of humanity that has somehow crafted false visions of the past to cover up for his true existence as one of the godlike creations from the dark age of technology, but that perhaps he lacked knowledge to create true beings like himself. The Primarchs were the nearest he came to it, but to bring them into being at all, he still needed more from the warp. This is wild, wild speculation, and it's not without many, many holes in it as well, but it's still food for thought. But if we're thinking about the Chaos Gods and the Emperor, it comes back to that issue again of the Emperor rushing to complete the Crusade, finish his great work. The Emperor was not just trying to wrap things up in a timely manner, he was pushing hard for the Crusade to get done. Anyone would assume he was seemingly on a clock, evidenced by his aggressive, reckless, even, development of Astartes during the Crusade, so much so that he genetically damaged them, and the impatience with worlds who took more convincing than others to be swayed into abandoning centuries or millennia of their own traditions and societal structures. It's always been this bone of contention. Was the Emperor deliberately distanced from the Astartes and the Primarchs, to whom he barely ever referred to as his sons? Were they just tools, or did he truly attempt to make something in his own image to the best of his ability? I think the answer, unsurprisingly, lies somewhere in the middle, the shades of grey answer. There's certainly nothing wrong with feeling attached to something you laboured to create, but at the same time the Emperor clearly has no qualms about making sacrifices of such things without the slightest hesitation. But if you really want to go off the rails, take a heavy in-fiction approach to it, when we consider that in M41, with 10,000 years since the Emperor supposedly walked among humanity, there are serious questions many could ask about did he exist at all. Seeing the Emperor through the eyes of humans of the Imperium in M41, how can they possibly know if he were real or not? A minuscule number of humans from the Galactic Imperial Empire will visit Terra in their lifetimes. Fewer, if any, would witness the palace, fewer still the Golden Throne, and any who did so would be slaughtered in psychic sacrifice. But on the more basic ground for humanity in M41, the Emperor exists as this unknowable figure. For many, he's an absolute central focus for their lives, but to others, a mythical legend that people speak of out among the stars, watching over us from Holy Terra. The planet itself is mythical. Citizenry likely wonder if this is a real place at all, or just something from stories and scripture. They'll never see it. They'll never see outside of their hive city districts. So is the Emperor a constructive, benevolent entity for humanity? Few who seem to have known him prior to his brutal wars of subjugation seem to think so. In fact, they nearly all abandoned him or attempted to stop his actions. Nearly all the immortal humans known as Perpetuals have any time for the Emperor. The Custodes and Astartes who he created were in the first case literally genetically designed to obey him, and in the second heavily indoctrinated that it would take extreme actions to corrupt and turn them against him. He treated his warriors often demonstrably as a means to an end, a tool to get the job done. So is it fair or even reasonable to consider that the Emperor may in fact have had less than good intentions? Was he the true saviour, just doing what had to be done because no one else would or could? A lone, uniquely powerful mortal who traversed all of human history, and after watching it avoid total destruction by a razor-thin margin for the last time, finally said, enough is enough. He emerges in the shadow of the fall from humanity's golden age and picked up the torch. The fact that this version is difficult to even solidly argue says enough on its own to me, especially when many rightly question why did he not act prior to the fall of humanity if he were indeed always so powerful? Why did he not store a vast library of STC if he were all-knowing? The questions will just go on, and it's why it leads many to the conclusion that something is deeply amiss here. It's not a convincing picture, and there are critical pieces missing from the puzzle. Now, I will say, it is of course easy to paint the Emperor as being this apathetic super being who is looking at things on such a big picture level that his actions merely appear to be cold and indifferent to ordinary humans. I always think not entirely dissimilarly to Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen, where they're both so powerful, so transcendent, that they become disconnected from what it means to be an ordinary mortal human. This is honestly somewhat true for some, not all, of the Primarchs as well, and we've seen this even among the Astartes. Some understand the mortality of humans, others become entirely disconnected from it, which was incidentally one of the reasons some traitor Astartes turned away from humanity. They saw themselves as the next stage, and perhaps we might consider that this was in fact why the Emperor kept them at distance, treated them as a means to an end, because he didn't want to validate any of that kind of behaviour further. But maybe also because he didn't want to become too connected to something that he knew was going to have to ultimately be discarded, as he had done several times before. It's understandable how the Emperor could have become disconnected from the value and lives of individual humans when he has lived for such a massive period of time. If he did indeed emerge from the earliest days of mankind, by the time we reach M30, that's a lot of life to have lived and still keep things in perspective. One might see how his focus could become so grandiose and seemingly under a ticking clock of time pressure. At the same time, of course, it must be said that we have many instances where the Emperor appears genuinely heartfelt and considerate to ordinary humans. The Astartes also, many of them give considerable time, care and thought to the needs of ordinary human citizens, and you see this even with Guilliman in the newer material. And the cynical would perhaps say, well, in the Emperor's case, he was the man of 1,000 faces. This was just another of his masterful misdirections. Well, perhaps, but it goes further, and this is what brings me back to my favourite vehicle for interesting storytelling, which is of course moral and ethical ambiguity. Now, just stepping out of the in-fiction world for a moment, we know that there are aspects of the lore that can be relied upon. I usually qualify these as things that are widely seen and documented, and therefore we can say with reasonable certainty that they are a thing. This usually means equipment, factional organization, planetary history, figures, battles, and so on. These are things so widely seen and continually documented and commented upon that we can consider them established. At the same time, however, there is so much in 40k that is open to interpretation, you can never be wholly certain, really, of anything. It's more we consider how much weight do we give something. If it's more visible, more common, then it's going to be more solid. Even if something is barely mentioned or only told through the lens of second-hand stories, dreams or visions, that makes it far more questionable as to its authenticity. One of the biggest issues when it comes to the warp and the chaos gods that I've touched on before is this idea of relative perspective, that is moral relativism. The idea that just because something is seen from one perspective as inherently abhorrent and immoral is only so when it is framed within the limited perspective of our own culture or time-based perspective. Now that's of course the abstract philosophical perspective. In reality, your average person understands that what actions we all know to be unacceptable because as humans who exist in society, our lives are shaped by morality, because it's a necessary framework to enable stable constructive civilization. Of course, unfortunately, there are exceptions to the rule, which is why we have laws to enact upon those individuals who would carry out actions that are considered morally objectionable, abhorrent, indefensible. And yes, I need to pull this back some before I spin off into a discussion about the human condition, historically, man's inhumanity to man, and where do we draw the lines for ourselves within different cultures, societies, and so on. It's an interesting area for discussion, but it can get pretty heavy, and we're of course thinking about this purely within the context of humanity in M41. Now, I came back to the start of this section to make a small amendment note to say that things get a little meandering from here. So, buckle up. And yes, I used some movie references as well. So, is morality real? In the sense of, is it a real thing, similar to how we would consider the laws of physics, given that it seems to passively dictate how most people in a society or a civilization function? Obviously, it's straightforward to understand that no, this is not the case when you see how anyone could break the unwritten rules of society, but this is only considering the very clear-cut examples. Somebody commits a murder, we think, okay, bad, except even something like that is on a sliding scale, isn't it? If someone's life is threatened, it can be seen as permissible to defend yourself. If we consider something like war, the idea that someone could go from doing a day job within normal society, then you're sent to a battlefield where you've shifted the boundaries of what is considered immoral. This as a concept is something most people tend to avoid thinking about for obvious reasons. It's pretty heavy and it leads to some fairly depressing conclusions. But even that in itself is something which has of course been heavily commented on historically. You have explorations of the human condition, questions around morality itself explored in movies like Apocalypse Now. Now such examples are of course a very binary thing, but it's an easy example because you're taking something that in normal everyday life is totally unacceptable, we have laws against it, and in some instances people might even use the adjective of evil to describe those who break through those boundaries. It's stranger you can take that thing which is abhorrent in normal society, and as you transition to a different situation, suddenly not only is it considered acceptable, it's considered necessary, sanctioned even, something you could even be rewarded for. Now, I'm not here to debate the broader points of that argument, I simply wanted to make the pretty simplistic example that there exists not one, but multiple states of moral truth. And because people don't want their lives to be consumed, like I said, by pondering these very depressing philosophical concepts, it's not something that people generally invest a lot of time in. It is, though, why, for example, I personally feel that describing a person who has committed an undeniably horrific crime as evil is inherently unconstructive. It may be true and valid to ascribe such a description in an emotional sense, but it also can lead to a dismissiveness or collective unwillingness to face the conditions, reality, and circumstances that led to that event taking place at all, which ultimately means you are going to be less successful in understanding how you might be able to prevent that in the future. So in saying that person who did that thing is evil, very often tends to lead to a sense that they were some kind of unstoppable force. This was a situation that was entirely unpreventable because evil. They were an evil person, a corrupted soul, a darkened force who existed outside the ordinary human condition. Nothing could ever have been done about it. Except very often that's just completely wrong. And even if it was somehow true in a specific circumstance, it's still not very constructive. And that sense of unconstructive or constructiveness for society and civilizations in a bigger, broader sense tends to be what often I see people deem as a solid marker for whether something is morally acceptable or not. Is it constructive in the bigger picture? Now, admittedly, it's not the singular gauge. There's other things like just established civility. But this idea of is it constructive in a broader sense tends to be, like I say, how people accept and allow actions that would be otherwise immoral to become moral. The problem, of course, is that what we may view as constructive tends to be subjective, which is why we're always endlessly arguing about such issues. So with that in mind, the 1979 movie Apocalypse Now, based upon the book Heart of Darkness, it's as good as any, perhaps, to make a point about the difficulty in interpreting morality and the issues raised by moral relativism. So it's of course always a gamble to take an analogy from a movie, not least a war movie, because people have very differing views. It relies on assuming people have seen it as well, and lastly people get really weirdly passionate about their opinions on movies, like really weirdly passionate. Especially when they're often very subjective with their themes and ideas. People seem to have this thing about really wanting to lock stuff down and being correct or not. I never really understand that because people can have different opinions about one thing. It's fine. And war movies in general seem to attract a lot of heated debate, usually about if it's anti or pro-war. That seems to be the default thing. But in so doing, people often miss the point entirely, because whilst they're thinking about that, they're not thinking about how the fact that these things are very often a backdrop for a deeper exploration of humanity. The strange thing with war movies is they're often able to work at both a superficial and a much deeper philosophical level, which is why they can be so interesting. Similarly, Terrence Malick's Thin Red Line that I've talked about before. Sorry, I'm just imagining what kind of unlimited budget any cast war movie Denis Villeneuve would make. Anyway, Apocalypse Now is one of those films that has an interesting amount of ambiguity itself, in how it depicts and reveals to us different characters and realities. The character of relevance obviously is Colonel Kurtz. If you haven't seen the movie, heavy spoilers for the next minute or so. But for those of you who don't care at all about spoilers like me, Kurtz is this highly decorated US officer running a special forces team deep in the jungle of the Vietnam War. He basically goes rogue and disappears and becomes an embarrassing headache for the US military, who want to have him eliminated before things get even worse. Now that's just the very brief notes to his character. We discover Kurtz, who is a highly educated, thoughtful individual, has essentially had a complete mental breakdown as a result of his experiences. The trauma of war has reshaped his worldview, but it goes a lot deeper than this. Kurtz is such a deep thinker, he's highly philosophical, and because of his character and intelligence has become completely mentally broken by his attempting to reconcile the incompatible moral positions of his military orders versus bearing witness to the consequences, further complicated by other experiences and atrocities. All of this demonstrate to him the unbreakable mental willpower required by those who stand and resist. Kurtz is brought to the conclusion that war cannot have any moral justification nor moral position to stand by, and in an attempt to search for something to replace this moral void, he uses his own willpower, but ultimately nothing can fill the void, and so he becomes consumed by the darkness, which is this realization that without any sense of moral order, all that can be is horror, destruction, chaos, much like the chaos in 40K, which is why by the end he famously speaks the phrase, the horror. The horror. Kurtz is unable to make any sense of the complete destruction of morality that he has witnessed through the hypocritical, superficial morality of the military and their contradictory nature, that he can be authorized to commit brutal missions, even atrocities, but only if he's authorized to do so. This is ultimately what sends him over the edge. How can someone with an educated mind morally reconcile those two things? He makes the only conclusion that makes sense to him. To be clear, for Kurtz, it's not the acts of war and atrocity themselves that push him over the edge, it's the sheer absurdity of officials making a charade out of pretending what they're doing is not morally abhorrent. That brings Kurtz to the destructive realization that morality is not a real thing, it's just illusory. Because how can it make sense that 1 minute it's fine for him to be running these fully authorized campaigns of brutal horror, but the next minute if he's not been told to do so, then it's a crime? These two things are just for him at a moral level fundamentally incompatible. A contributing factor though is also some of his experiences. He sees the sheer willpower of those that he is fighting against, and comes to this realization that it's not about being a good or a bad person. It's not about having love or hate or evil in your heart. It's about having that willpower, and that's essentially what he becomes, this vessel for willpower alone. There's a great line which underscores the insanity of the whole thing in the movie when we're reading through some of the reports that have been made by the military about Kurtz, where essentially it's explained that they still wanted to get him back on board despite how crazed and unhinged and out of control he'd become, because he was very efficient and very good at what he was doing, which really underscores the horror of the whole situation, which is that despite the atrocities he's committing, they still want to get him back on board. It's not about morality, it's about whether they can control him or not. The annihilation of the self is so destructive in Kurtz that by the end he appears to have become so nihilistic he seems barely to care if he or anyone else lives or dies. Now I know this tangent seemed very way off the scheduled plan here, but I hope you can see that what I'm trying to say, how it's come to my mind anyway, is that when it comes to the Emperor, it's important that if we're considering what might come next for the Imperium and the galaxy, we understand him for who he is, that he's not an unstained god. He has blood on his hands, billions of innocents. He's as flawed and problematic as the gods he seeks to destroy. For all we know, he could also be as broken and hollowed out as Colonel Kurtz. Given how the Emperor, similarly to Kurtz, has the propensity to disregard human life and commit mass destruction on the slightest pretext, I think it's genuinely possible that the Emperor long ago lost any real sense of morality at all. His visions for the future of humanity require, at least on some level, the acceptance that morality is illusory, as is already all too clear. For the Emperor, victory must come at any cost, and if there is not someone with the will to do so, then all will fall to darkness, to the horror. The problem, of course, is that the price has to be paid for by humanity. Now, I think admittedly today, things did go slightly more Luton than they needed to. I don't know what to tell you, unfortunately, it's just how my brain works. Things go round and round, and I consider something, then I come back to it a second, a third, a fourth time to try and find different angles to it. I think one thing we can all readily understand is that the Emperor is of course ambiguous, very much by design, to be this enigma, myth, or legend, a unifying symbol for humanity more than anything. So how about that initial main question from the start? Did the Emperor willingly walk into his own state of perpetual death, both knowingly and willingly, and if so, why? My position on that is yes, I truly think he did. I may be wrong, of course. When will we find out? Who can say? But I think it honestly makes a lot of sense. One possibility that many believe and that I think remains absolutely plausible was that he was going to take humanity into his new Webway project to starve the Chaos Gods, and then for humanity to emerge later once the warp was pacified. But that if he found somehow the means to be reborn in the warp to take control of the warp itself, maybe all this would then not even be necessary. I also want to mention about the Emperor being worshipped by humanity for 10,000 years. It's deeply suspect that the Golden Throne and Astronomicon held such future-proofing capacity, and moreover, how do we know for certain that the sacrifice of Psychers were merely keeping him alive, allowing him to power the Astronomicon? Who really has set that in stone as a fact? No one really. If there's one thing we know about the Chaos Gods, it's that they're empowered by the emotions and the worship of humans and also devour their souls from the warp. So it's not much of a stretch to see how the Emperor could have been doing the same for the past 10,000 years, and that now it's finally bearing fruit. The Emperor may well be coalescing in the warp as the Star Child. And I just want to remind you again of the actions of the Emperor, denying his divinity, dressing as a gold giant, and all the other less than subtle actions. He was either laying it on so thick that no one would believe someone could be so blatant and then outright deny it. And I was going to make a counterpoint to that here, but I genuinely couldn't think of a reason why someone would brutally subjugate humanity to become the supreme leader of a people who that said person is more than well aware that they have historically had a very, very difficult time not worshipping divine beings or heavily reading into things that are not there, and then that same said person who appears to be able to at will appear in different forms specifically chooses an outfit for themselves as a giant bathed in light, dressed all in gold, who goes around carrying out miracles with one hand and an army of superhuman warriors to enact his immense wrath with the other, all the while specifically telling everyone that you're definitely not a god. Yeah, definitely nothing was going to go wrong with that plan. Certainly no one could see it coming that the highly susceptible, extremely easily manipulated human race were not going to nod and wink themselves into becoming insanely devout worshippers of the giant golden immortal man who really looks like a god, acts like a god, and has the powers of a god. So I do think that yes, the Emperor knowingly planned his fall. I think that much like the Amalathians at this point, he knows exactly what he was doing, and that his 10,000 year plan is coming to fruition. He could not destroy the gods of chaos from the material realm, and so he must battle them in their own domain, on their own terms. The only plausible way for that to happen is to enter that space himself, using the collective worship and power of humanity to fuel him. The big question remains though, are the Emperor's intentions for humanity morally sound or not? Will all the sacrifices and suffering balance in the bigger picture for humanity and the Imperium? These are the questions that we cannot answer. The Emperor's agenda, his ultimate purpose, are very unclear, and who knows what could have happened to him through that 10,000 years. If he does emerge as a god, what kind of god will he be, as we discussed before? It could be the dawn of a new golden age for humanity, but it could also be a new age of fear and zealotry, of worship, and in a very strange way, galactic domination by a new power of the warp. One small other thing, it always seemed somewhat unbelievable, some might say suspiciously unbelievable to me, that the Emperor could have been so crippled by Horus. We of course know that Horus was the captain planet of chaos at that specific moment in time, using their powers combined to become the warp's greatest champion, but the fact that the Emperor was still able to not just finish him, but literally erase him from existence, I think it showed he had more than enough left in him to do something that is barely known to have happened at any other time. Now, of course, it's also said that maybe the Chaos Gods saw Horus slipping, they knew it was better to get him out of the way, and at that moment realised it was time enough to pull back their power, thus enabling the Emperor to finally kill him. Although I also often consider, what if the Chaos Gods had that moment of realisation? What if the Gods of the Warp had been lulled into being drawn into the Emperor's trap, and at that last moment realised what was happening and pulled back? Maybe they saw what the Cabal saw, that victory for Horus meant their own impending annihilation. Soon we hope to get some information on one of the most fundamental questions in 40k, which is how did the final battle with the Emperor and Horus play out? And we do need some clarity, because there are conflicting accounts from the older and later elements of the lore here. These may well speak to the nature of the Emperor for us. Did the Emperor hold back from destroying Horus because he was one of his Primarch sons, and only when he saw Horus's clear and complete corruption was he able to destroy him fully? That idea conflicts with this picture we have built of the Emperor barely speaking about his Primarchs as sons, and seeing them more as tools to complete just a stage of his grand vision, that potentially they may have even been discarded later. There's of course that description in the older lore where the Emperor, quote, forces all mercy and compassion from his mind, empties it of all knowledge and friendship and camaraderie and love. His eyes lock with Horus and sees understanding there. Then with full cold knowledge of what he's doing, the Emperor destroys the War Master. It doesn't sound a lot like the Emperor we know to me. What's interesting about that is that we could believe that at the end of the final battle of the heresy, that moment with Horus was what brought about a major change in the character of the Emperor, and that this was then further whittled down and spiritually emaciated over 10,000 years, so that by the time Guilliman visits with him on Terra in M41, it's understandable that what he sees is something completely unrecognisable as his air quotes father. My honest opinion, I think the way the scraps of information are coming together, it does appear that perhaps things are moving towards this situation where the Emperor is going to be reborn in the warp itself, and I should remind this doesn't mean he's going to be trapped there forever either. The Eldar gods were able to seemingly walk in and out of the material and immaterial space. Although I imagine what could happen is some kind of situation where the Emperor remains in the warp and becomes a part of the great game. He speaks to the mortal humans back in reality through the use of avatars and heralds, prophets speaking on his behalf, while he maintains his attention on the war in the warp, fueled by the faith and worship of a galaxy of human followers. Or it could be more cataclysmic. It could be some kind of event where in a short time the Emperor does re-emerge and fights a massive battle to calm the warp. What if the Emperor allied with the Eldari and combined with Aeneid to lead some kind of ultimate battle to destroy the Chaos Gods, and when all was said and done, the Necrons sweep in, use their Blackstone to seal the rift, bringing some semblance of normalcy back to the galaxy. But I don't think so. I think in truth these wild speculations will never be realised, nor will they happen anytime soon. I actually question if in terms of lore we would see the rebirth of the Emperor in my lifetime. I'm not joking, I'm completely serious. The lore of 40k moves so slowly, I might actually not be here to see it happen. What I do think though is that things are leaning toward the Emperor coalescing in the warp, and who knows how long that's going to take. I think from the descriptions and visions people are having across the Imperium, the Emperor's tarot becoming stronger, more accurate, the Sororitas seemingly having their powers more than they ever did, this may well start to begin answering that other frustrating question I've asked a while back of how do the Sororitas powers work? If they're not psychers, I think the answer is they sort of like the Orcs have some means by which to directly channel the Emperor's power from the warp using their faith. So that if, for example, they're in a null zone like the Pariah Nexus, somehow they can still utilize it, even when Psychers cannot. And now that we know what's happening sort of with the Emperor and the Warp, that makes more sense. I think this situation of the emergent new man, this coalescing Emperor, the Star Child, is what will become the situation for some time. There always remains this question of, if the Emperor is not on the Golden Throne, well then, what happens there? I think it's pretty straightforward actually, and I think this goes toward the case for the Emperor actually having foreseen all the things that would come to pass, and why they unfolded as they did. I think he definitely wanted the Imperium to become hyper-religious to fuel him as a god. I think he knew why that was necessary. I think he saw this critical time that would see an explosion in the number of human psychers, this psychic awakening, and because of that, I think the designs of things like the Golden Throne and the Astronomicon were made to accommodate this increase of psychers, so that when the time came, the Emperor could actually leave and be reborn, and the systems ensure that the Golden Throne is maintained, the security of Terra is safe, the Astronomicon continued to function, likely still somehow tethered to the Emperor, but being fueled by more psychers than ever before. I do wish things, as always, were a little more clear-cut at this point, so I didn't have to wildly speculate and guess quite so much, and who knows if I'm even close to being right about any of this stuff. But in my head right now, this is what seems to make the most logical sense. I never really bought this idea of escaping into the webway. We never got enough information about how that was really going to solve anything, other than yes, maybe starving chaos very slowly. Seems quite a project, doesn't it? Shifting all of humanity in some galactic exodus into the webway. If you ever move house, it takes a long time, it's a lot of effort. So the idea of moving a galaxy of humanity into the webway is the most insanely complicated logistical nightmare ever. Unless of course the answer to it was more dark than we anticipated. Maybe the Emperor's webway plan was not to bring humanity there and secure it safely away. Maybe what he was going to do was just select a few billion humans, maybe just the Psychers and his Custodes, and disappear into the webway with them forever, leaving the Astartes and regular humans to deal with whatever was left out in the galaxy. And then over time, once he's built up some kind of psychic empire, emerge and wage like some new war. Who knows? But for now at least, I'm pretty firmly on the emergent Starchild Emperor train. It's the thing which has been given the most nods to. It also makes a lot of sense in the grand scheme of things. It aligns with what we've been seeing, it aligns with the events and the fact that the Imperium is facing its most destructive situation since the heresy in the form of the Great Rift. So it seems right that now is the time the Emperor would begin to reappear, and despite not being fully present, at least begin to exert his influence, and this is demonstrably happening. We've seen it in things like Dark Imperium. It's happening so visibly that even Guilliman is starting to have second thoughts. But anyway, that's where we are. Disagree? Have a better theory? Tell me in the comments below. I think a good time to revisit this would be after the conclusion to the Siege of Terra series, dependent on if it gives some new solid insights. But I think to conclude, we'll consider that something which has always been a bit of an eye-roll statement. The Emperor protects. Something the brainwashed faithful of the Imperium would just say offhand because they've been saying it all their lives. But right now, in M41, with the increasing power and presence of the Emperor in the dreams, visions, even lives of the faithful, the servants of the Imperium, the preachers who would walk unarmed into battle against the nightmares of chaos and somehow emerge untouched, Now, at this most devastating of times in M41, this period of true darkness for the Imperium, the Emperor actually does protect.